There you go.
Testing, 1, 2.
That's okay now. Some more?
Need to let them know we're ready to go, huh?
Anytime.
Okay. We will call the February the 1st, 2001 Metropolitan Cable Television Commission to order. Madam Secretary, would you call the roll?
Yes. Jones?
Here.
Gora?
Here.
Natoli? Dickinson? Susan Peters McEwen for Supervisor Johnson? Collin?
Here.
Yee?
Here.
Nilo?
I'm here.
Waters?
Aye.
Shelby?
Here.
We have a quorum.
This meeting of the Sacramento Metropolitan Cable Television Commission has been videotaped in its entirety and will be cablecast without interruption on Metro Cable 14, the government affairs channel on the Comcast cable system. Today's meeting has been cablecast live and will be repeated Saturday, February 3rd at 12 noon on Channel 14. A VHS copy is also available for checkout from any library branch. Members of the audience wishing to address the board should fill out a speaker identification form located on the back table and give it to the microphone when addressing the board and state your name for the record.
We have community programming funding criteria and goals.
I think we're going to move.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
No.
Move item 4 up to number 1, election of chairperson, vice chair.
Trying to get off the chair right at the first of the meeting.
Couldn't wait.
Well, I would Waters to chair our commission
Second.
next.
Is there a second?
Second, I guess. Discussion?
I knew Roger would have some discussion.
On the question? I've been moved in second. Roll call.
Roll call. Ooh. It's going to be close.
That's for those who want to vote no.
Give everybody a chance.
Roger Dickinson did.
Jones?
Please, Roger.
Aye.
Gora?
Aye.
Natoli? Dickinson?
Aye.
Johnson, McEwen?
Aye.
Collin?
Yes.
Yee?
Aye.
Nilo?
Yes.
Waters?
If Roger Nilo voted yes, I'll vote yes, too. Thank you.
Shelby?
Super yes.
Motion
Here you go,
approved.
sir.
Okay.
Congratulations.
Yes.
And I don't wear this hat.
There's not much doubt about that.
Big for my head.
Is it one of the small cities?
Thank you very
Oh,
much.
it's the county. Yeah.
To all of the rest of the people on the commission for electing me to this position. I would especially thank Tony Gora, who nominated me as vice chair a couple of years ago, because I was en route to be chairman a few years ago when I stumbled and didn't make it, but I'm now here now and looking forward to this. With all the things that are happening with AT&T and the acquisition, and I think it's going to be a very interesting year. So thank you all for supporting me and voting me in. And with that, Madam Clerk, we'll go to...
Well, do you want a vice chair?
Need a vice chair. Sorry, we might want
Well, why don't we do this to, Don Natoli is not here to protect himself. We have not
Here he
seen
comes.
I nominate Don Natoli.
Second. That's
a motion. I second.
Your name tag here. You're the man.
Yeah, we can just do a, shall we do?
Hey, let's do a roll call vote on Don. He's a lot more popular. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none? Even Don?
Congratulations, Don.
Thanks, Ms. Collins.
Be a good team, Don.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Item number 1, please.
Community programming funding criteria and goals.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm going to try and set this up a little bit, and as your commission may recall, back during last budget hearings in June, you had directed staff to hire a consultant to basically help come up with some criteria and develop funding criteria, and to review the existing goals for the community programming or the PEG groups, the public education and government channels that you've financed for many years. After the RFP went out, there was a subcommittee. We selected a consultant out of Portland, Oregon called Management Resources. They began their work basically in late September, and since that time, basically through the months of November and December, they did considerable interviewing. And in fact, I believe that almost every one of you were contacted. The vast majority of you were interviewed directly by the consultant. The grantees, each one of those was interviewed by the consultant. Several other staff was interviewed. Basically a whole number of people were interviewed. In addition, Management Resources was some sort of national studies and looking at how we fund our things compared to other communities across the country. And they've been in collecting data to see how we sort of benchmark against those folks. In addition, during January, one of the things that your commission had talked about was getting some advice from policymakers and people in the community that pay attention to these channels and can speak for the different groups. And so we held a workshop we had over almost 40 people attend that workshop for 3 hours on a weekday morning. And again, the consultant will talk about the different viewpoints that came out of that. And then today, the purpose is another workshop session for the consultant after all that sort of data collection and interviewing and things, is to kind of give you today where she's at, sort of a preliminary findings of some of her research, as well as even maybe some preliminary leanings as to where some of the recommendations may be coming down. The idea today is for you to listen to what she has to say and then give input to her. She will then finalize, take the input that she hears from you, take the input that she hears from the public and any testimony, and then finalize that and come back and be ready basically for the March meeting of the Commission to talk about the adoption of any criteria. One thing I want to point out that we got to be careful of today is, while that process is going along, and it is on schedule, this is always what we anticipated, another process is beginning, and that is the budgetary process for this coming year. Usually in the March timeframe, and here's how we'd like to try and blend these two together, is you usually give estimates to the grantees as to how they should prepare their budget. Now, in the last week or so, I've been finding out why Rich quit this job, I think, is in looking over the tapes of the previous couple years' meetings and kind of looking at this budget process. There certainly is, I think, a lot of confusion and aggravation, especially in the March hearing, as to the process where we kind of go through, where you tend to be asked to give estimates of a budget based on, without ever seeing what the grantees are going to do, how they're, and it tends to lead to frustration on both sides. What I think we're going to try and do is try and keep this sort of separate. What I hope to do today is have the consultant talk about what is going to happen in her criteria and keep the thing off of funding. Next month, I'm trying to kind of play my hand here, but what I'm going to hope is we'll go and we'll do that. It's a contractual obligation, and I'm going to be leaning towards just recommending a status quo budget and maybe having the grantees, as they're preparing their budget, they can ask for additional requests, 10% more, 20% more within their budgets, but that you basically instruct them to go status quo. The reason I want to do it that way is then you can talk about the criteria. Once you establish criteria, they'll be putting their budget together, and they can come forward with their budgets. We can analyze the budgets according to that criteria and then make some type of recommendation in your final budget hearings in June. I'm going to sit down next week with the grantees and sort of talk about this process, but I don't want to give anybody any sort of ideas that at this point that today is the day to start fighting for money. That's not what this is about. This is to establish criteria so that when money is going to be given out in June, that there is a process which hopefully we can all live with. I think the time frame can work to do it that way, but so that every month, or basically in March, is when we'll really start dealing with that. I just have a feeling it's going to come up several times today. So with that, I'd like to let the consultant give her recommendations, where she's at, her findings, and then take testimony and go from there. But I'd be happy to answer any questions before I introduce Sue.
Are there any questions? I just, maybe a clarification, Paul. If you do the status quo plus X percent. I would just like to make it understood, because that's at least where my thinking is that it's not going to be X for every single group. It might be X plus 2 or X minus 2, so that we're going to look at them, at least I would like to have us look at them individually, and before we make our final decision as to what percentage of an increase we'll give them.
And certainly that's the discretion of the commission. You're absolutely correct.
Okay.
So if there's no other question on process, I'd like to bring up Sue Disciple, who is the president of Resources, who is the consultant who we've hired, and I'm going to kind of hand it over to her. She's got a fairly lengthy presentation on some background and try and get through it. I think she's got different parts that what we're going to try and do is she goes through a section, then the commission can ask questions, and then go through another section and ask questions along the way.
A very brief question before you start. Is there somewhere we're going to be able to get copies of your research and reports before our meeting or next meeting?
The intent is that actually within the next week or two, she's close to writing a report now, is that we will get one as soon as I get a draft of that report, I'll probably have the grantees review it for accuracy just to make sure that there's no mistakes. But the intent is that we get that report out really by the middle of February in the next couple weeks, so that you have more than even the typical time frame to review it before the next meeting.
Good.
Good afternoon, Commissioners, and thanks for giving me this time on your agenda today. It's interesting for me to be here because in my other life in Portland, sometimes I sit where you are because I serve on the Mount Hood Cable Regulatory Commission, and I am one of the commissioners to that body representing the City of Portland. Like yourselves, we are a joint multi-jurisdictional regulatory commission. So I beg your indulgence with a fairly lengthy presentation today, and because I am often subjected to such presentations myself, I will try to keep it brief, as brief as possible. As Paul said, I think we are close to writing a report, but we have deliberately tried to leave our kind of final positions in a flux or conceptual mode, because we were anticipating this work session and that commission members might have something that they needed to give us input about that would influence our thinking about the data we've gathered. And I say that mainly because I believe, and I think what you see around the country would bear it out, as well as the way cable-related issues have been framed in federal law, that decisions about cable-related resources are rightfully local. And I feel somewhat presumptuous actually today, even standing before you and making recommendations that are oriented toward your community, because ultimately, especially decisions about public benefit services in the cable system are essentially local. And the unique values, situations, and circumstances of communities are the major influencer in how those decisions should be made. But that said, I understood that the commission was looking for, and let me kind of go to my PowerPoint now, which is more talking points for me than it's probably going to be that interesting for you, because it's mainly text. But when we accepted this project, it was based on your RFP that asked us to recommend objective criteria for making funding decisions, and we interpreted that also, and evaluating the performance of community access service providers. And also, you said to us, kind of as a third or fourth thought in the RFP, by the way, our goals for community programming are 10 years old, and we're interested in your review of those. So we've embarked on that process, and I think are coming close to the conclusion of that process. A couple of things I want to say before we go into the whole presentation is that in the PowerPoint, I have documented what we believed were quantitative kinds of discovery or measures that we've discovered in our research, but that I want to make some qualitative comments. And so we understand asked us to look for objective criteria, but I think there's influencing factors, and I want to point those out along the way. One other thing I do want to point out is that what is frequently employed practice relative to PEG is not necessarily good practice. This is not a this is not an old industry. This is relatively new kind of resource in communities, only 20 to 25 years old in some communities. We're still learning as we go. I'm going to break my my presentation into a couple of chapters. So I'll be addressing a little bit of background, some assumptions that we made at the start of the project, our findings, the best practices that we discovered in the research, and then the concepts on which we believe we will be basing our recommendations to you. I'm going to stop at the end of each of those kind of chapters, and if the chair wishes to open the floor to commissioner questions, those would probably be good spots to do that. So, just a quick overview. As commissioners know, the Cable Communications Policy Act in 1984 enabled local franchising authorities to do a couple of things. It didn't require them, but it enabled them to require cable operators channels set aside for PEG access. It enabled LFAs to require services, facilities, equipment, and other types of support for public access use, education and government access use, and franchise fees up to 5% of gross revenues. And the thinking of Congress around this was the public rights of way are valuable. There should be an exchange with communities for the use of rights of way. That said, there is some marked difference between the franchises that one sees when you look nationwide that were established pre-84 Act and more modern franchises, some of which were later entries of cable in certain markets. Others are renewed franchises. The old franchises have run their 10, 12, 15 years, now been renewed. In Sacramento, you've had for a long time. You entered into your original negotiations pre-Cable Act of 84. You have some legacy provisions from that original way of thinking, much of it pre-84 Act, about PEG resources. Also, because there's been a long history here, I know, and I'm telling everybody and that podium knows more about this than me, but there's been a history of lawsuits, of traditions, of franchise transfers, and what you have brought forward is legacy provisions in your franchise or traditions, and they include that for a long time or for a period of time you have been receiving less than 5% of the franchise fees allowable under the Act. And of course I understand that history is past now and you're transitioning, but that has been part of a recent legacy. You have no funding or other in-kind support specifically for PEG other than what flows from franchise fees. That is not the norm, particularly in modern cable franchises in jurisdictions of your size. Most jurisdictions have additional franchise-related resources and are not just dependent on those general fund monies, franchise fees. Another legacy, there are no provisions here for other kinds of community benefits, such as INETs, grant programs, such as you might see in more modern franchises. And I think the case I'm trying to make here is that it's not been a rich environment for PEG as some environments are. In my own city, we have, in addition to our franchise fee funding for PEG, we have another 3% of the cable operator's gross revenues that is dedicated to public uses of the cable system. So we contribute approximately 3% of gross revenues, in other words, 3 of the 5% we get for PEG operating, but then there's another 3% of the operator's gross revenues for innovative uses of the system and capital expenses of PEG and our INET. So we actually have double the kind of funding stream that you have, and we are not anomaly. So I'm kind of trying to set the stage for this has been a rich environment for PEG, and I know that you know this. Other kinds of legacies that you see in your environment here is things like bandwidth tied to specific uses. And this was an interesting and probably useful concept in the old analog environment where we really didn't think about bandwidth, we thought about television channels. Some kinds of legacy concepts that you're still working with here is instead of just your public access channels, they're tied to certain uses. A free speech channel, a community use channel, a religious programming channel, which puts you in the situation where you may have nothing but scroll, and I'm not saying you do, because I have not watched the channel except briefly in Diane's office, but potentially you could be in a situation where you've got nothing but scroll on one channel, locked up with programming on another. Again, it's a legacy concept. More modern franchises focus on bandwidth for public uses rather than television channels locked to certain uses. And I think perhaps what I've found in my research, the most difficult and contentious of your legacy traditions or provisions is the concept, foreign to many communities that have PEG, of funding grantees. We have a very rich PEG system in my city of Portland, Oregon. And we work with many very rich PEG environments. We work with organizations from coast to coast. We're a consultant to Manhattan Neighborhood in a network in New York City, and also to Alelo, which is the PEG affiliate or PEG organization in Honolulu, Hawaii, and we work with a lot in between. But I've never encountered this concept of grantees. Now, we do have providers of public education and government access in our cities, and you would typically see that in any city where there was PEG, or any jurisdiction, from New York to Hawaii. But generally, it's a procurement. Most cities believe that, based on our community values, we've agreed we're going to dedicate a certain amount of money toward PEG. And we are going to procure those services from an appropriate and able provider. And that is the thinking. The interesting thinking that we've encountered in Sacramento is the thinking that organizations are funded. It's an entitlement model, not a procurement model. Now, this is probably not it's a mindset issue. It is perhaps might not even make that much difference when you actually write the check for the services. But there is not, in the discussion how services are provided here, the discussion seems to not so much be we're purchasing these valuable services, but we're giving money and channels capacity. Let's talk about the real thing of value here, channels to organizations. And our legacy, really pre-84 Act kinds of concepts that I think you have an opportunity to work your way out of and leave behind. As you know, just briefly, you dedicate about $1.3 million to PEG services, and that includes 1 government access channel, the 2 educational access channels, and 3 public access channels. Also 1 channel that is the public broadcasting affiliate, KVIE, and the audio portion of your Metro 14 procured through Capital Public Radio. So that's kind of the way. This is telling you no, and we can get back to. We'll come back to this in a bit. Okay, that was just some background. And before I go on to our methodology and our assumptions for our survey process, Mr. Chair, if you wish to entertain any questions, I would be happy to do so.
I think that you had a good idea. As you cover these subjects, you bring it to my attention, and then if there's any questions related to this part of the testimony, we can ask them now before we get just done.
Yeah, just a question to one of your comments in talking about the legacy provisions and the ones you touched on just a moment ago relative to the channels that are signed and the issue or idea of grantees versus some steady flow of dollars for programming. But you said this is something that you can work your way out of or get beyond. And do I take it that you see this as being a situation that's a negative one when you say that, or you're going to go through more presentation here, so I don't want to get ahead of you in your presentation, but do I take it that you see, even though it may be a way that was established years ago, that are you making a presumption or a conclusion that it's broken, so it needs a bigger fix than just talking about criteria for funding PEG? I'm trying to understand your comment, because you said get your way out of it, and I guess I'm not with you yet as to necessarily that it's broken, so I want to hear more.
Yeah. Again, you might write the check in the same way, but it's a different way of thinking about it, and it's a different kind of partnership relationship. It isn't a customer-vendor relationship or a partnership relationship. It's more of a parental kind of way of thinking about the relationship that in my opinion, adds a level of contentiousness to the discussion about PEG that's not productive. And we will get into it. We will get into it more.
Okay.
Well,
I'll hold my question. I'm just curious because the way you said it, I didn't make sure I was taking it in a fashion other than what you meant it.
Yeah.
So, but leading to something else. Okay.
Commissioner, I'd like to make it clear too that this is not a blame issue at all. I think that this kind of way of thinking about PEG is helpful to the Commission or helpful to the service providers, as you refer to them as grantees. It's just kind of an old way of thinking, and there's more productive ways of thinking that I think would foster more partnership. Just briefly.
Chair, one quick question. Earlier, you were talking about the amount of funding, and the implication was that there are plenty of other areas that plenty more money than we do here to these sorts of groups, and you made a comment of additional franchise fee revenues that's dedicated in other areas. What do you mean by that?
It's franchise-related revenue. It isn't franchise fee-related. The franchise fee is the up to 5% allowable to the jurisdiction that is payment into your general fund in exchange for rights of way. But other kinds of franchise-related funding for PEG is often required in modern franchises. To give you an example, in the Portland area jurisdictions, we receive the 5% franchise fee that goes into our general funds. We take some of that money back out and fund PEG just like you do. But in addition to that 5% franchise fee, we collect 3% of the operator's gross revenues in addition to the 5% franchise fee, but it's pegged for 1% goes to capital purchases to support PEG, 1% goes to support capital funding of our INET, and 1% goes to its capital grants for organizations that wish to make innovative uses of the public cable system, public part of the cable system. So we essentially 8%.
That's a function of the agreements.
That is a function of the agreement.
And that's really not an option until or unless other franchise switch occurs. I mean, that could have been something that could have been negotiated, I suppose, as part of this last go-around, though we actually had a number of other issues that we were trying to address.
And just to cover up or cover a semantic issue or discussion issue, what do you mean by INET?
An INET is an institutional network, and it is using the cable system to link public buildings and then use the cable system for high-speed data transmission, two-way video applications, or even for emergency alert resources. For instance, you might have the chief of police at the central precinct doing roll call and viewable by two-way video at every police station in your jurisdiction via your INET. And it's a dedicated system that is not available to commercial users of the system.
So it's a different sort of information technology system that utilizes the whole system, and it's specifically used by public entities.
Right, and as Paul pointed out, it's negotiated within a franchise, and I didn't mean to confuse the issue. I didn't bring it up as to suggest that that's a direction you will go or should go.
No, I didn't take it that way. I was just wondering what it was.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating application of the technology that, as far as I know, we've never even contemplated.
Yeah, we have 127 public sites within our jurisdiction wired. So it's very rich, but it has to be addressed at the front end of a franchise process. And we had a transfer that enabled us to negotiate for some of those things.
And the I stands for
Institutional.
institution.
Okay, Mr. Gibson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You used the term procurement model to contrast another method of approaching PEG versus what we do here. Who does the procuring? The commission?
Yes.
So you have a institutional bureaucracy that accepts applications or ideas from potential programmers or providers and then decides whether to fund them or not and give them access to the PEG, whether it's bandwidth or channels or where the medium is?
No, our model is not that much different than yours in actuality. It's just an approach. We issue an RFP. We are looking for a provider, somebody to manage our public education and government channels, and we issue an RFP. Now, we do have established providers, just like you do. You call them grantees, we call them providers. But there's a contract, and it has performance criteria in it. Our providers, grantees, submit a proposal to us, and others could submit one too. That said, we have not had a turnover of those organizations that have traditionally provided it, although we almost did. So it's a procurement model, really RFP driven.
Okay, I now understand what you're talking about.
Jones, did you have a question?
I did. It went to the 3% of operating revenues issue. Are we?
Maybe I can.
Are we? Would we have been legally permitted to have sought? I think I know the answer, but I'm interested in hearing it.
Well, as the commission will recall, you have a franchise that grew out of the settlements back in the 80s, and that franchise runs through 2024. And so you will not be looking at it in the absence of operators coming to you and requesting it. You would not be looking at a renegotiation of the franchise terms that you had from back in the 80s. At the time we did the transfer, as we discussed the transfer, you look at is the provider able to provide the same service with the same financial wherewithal, the same technical expertise as the old provider. It's an apples-to-apples kind of correlation and analysis. Because of the fee issue, that opened the door to some amount of negotiation, which we discussed at the time. It didn't open the door to a complete, I don't believe it opened the door to complete renegotiation of the entire franchise.
Which we could do in 2024.
Right. So to answer your question, I suppose we could have asked for something different than what we asked for, and we might have reached agreement in the same manner that we asked for, that they offered to change the franchise fee, and you accepted that offer in order to bring the transfer to a closure. But I don't believe we would have been in a situation where we would have been able to open all terms of the franchise and renegotiate the entire new franchise by reason of the transfer application.
Well, and we sort of reality tested that too, given how hard fought the negotiations were with regard to what we got, which I think was actually, from the perspective of the community, a very successful negotiation.
Concur.
Where we increased the franchise fee from 2.5% to 5%. We had some 16 or 17 service requests from the public access community that wanted to see carried over by AT&T, which we obtained, and as well. We restated this commission's belief that the franchisee still owes the access community 30 megahertz of bandwidth and agreed to a process for operating that dispute, which will be ultimately binding on both parties, which I feel confident that we will prevail in, should we not be able to resolve it, short of binding arbitration. I guess that goes to another point you raised about the in-kind support. My sense is the service, the continuation of the sort of in-kind, I'll call them in-kind service provision that Congress was providing to the access community that we rolled into the franchise transfer, the 17 points that the access community asked us to continue, as well as the setting aside of bandwidth, I think constitutes in-kind support. So I'm not sure it's accurate to say that we haven't assured in-kind support for the access channels. That is this cable commission.
Sure. No, I don't want the commission to misunderstand what I'm saying. We have a pre-84 franchise. Those communities who have post-1984 franchises, better franchises are more advantageous for the public because the Act enabled negotiation of those provisions. Communities that had cable and franchise pre-Cable Act of 84, many of them are left with a variety of legacy provisions that aren't as advantageous. And if you have a long franchise, it's very difficult to eliminate that legacy. I'm not suggesting that you didn't do something you could have done. It has to do with when your franchise was established. And also, just to speak to your other comment, we did not consider the value of bandwidth in our study. So all of the organizations we studied provide bandwidth for public uses. But I would absolutely agree with you that the cost of that bandwidth, or the value of that bandwidth, is extensive. Let me skip over just a little bit of the blah, blah, blah about how we did the study. I think I'm going to run out of time. And I just talk a little bit about some of the assumptions that we put into the study. First of all, we looked at the policies and practices of generally comparable local franchising authorities. We toured cable system size, number of subscribers, general population area, and whether or not they provided PE&G services. Also, where unified PEG, PEG funded all together, was the model. We did not consider that because we couldn't compare it to what you have. We did not make any kind of an assessment of community need, and I want that to be really clear. What I'm going to tell you about our findings really has to do with what other communities do. It doesn't address anything about the unique needs or characteristics of Sacramento. What others do might not be right for you. There was no community needs done by us or considered. And that needs to be clear. This is
and it was not requested as part of the RFP, too. So that was not something that they neglected to do. I mean, that was not requested.
We're not making a qualitative, we're not making mainly qualitative findings. And so we tried to identify some industry averages for the purposes of benchmarking and identifying best practices to get to this funding criteria spot. And then also, just want to let you know, what we found in our research was that there's some similarities, but there's a variation among franchising authorities as to how PEG funds are allocated. Studies just kind of finding their way as they go. So let me get down to some of the things that we found in our study. One of the things that we looked at is some of the characteristics that seemed to us unique in Sacramento. We want to see whether or not they were or were not. And in some cases, you do kind of share certain kinds of approaches to PEG with very few other jurisdictions. For instance, only one other example was found of a commission such as yourself funding a PBS affiliate or providing franchise-related funds to a PBS affiliate. There's many examples of PBS programming carried on public or education channels. But in terms of a PBS affiliate having one of the public cable channels and receiving funding to manage that channel, we only found the one example in the state of Hawaii. State regulates cable on a statewide basis in Hawaii. We only had one other example of a franchise-funded cable FM radio station in Fairfax, Virginia. We found no other examples of franchise-related funding of programming from local NPR affiliates. Now again, this may be really important and appropriate stuff to do in your community. I have no way at all to evaluate that, only giving you the quantitative report on what's found by looking at 40 other similar jurisdictions. We found one other jurisdiction that is operating a local PEG channel that is segregated, dedicated to religious programming only. It was in Dayton, Ohio, only other one that we found. Most other comparable franchises include provisions to funding for PEG in addition to the franchise fees. So most of the other communities we looked at have somewhat of a richer funding environment because they have other streams of revenue coming to PEG than you have in Sacramento. Again, it's an age of the franchise issue.
Can you give some examples of other types of funding with beyond franchise or the 3% that you're talking about?
Okay. Some franchises that were signed after the '84 Act, but not after the Communications Act of '96, have provision to provide operating funds for PEG, in addition to the 5% franchise fee. The ability to require the operator to provide operating funds was eliminated in '96 by Congress, but you can still require a PEG operator to provide funding for capital to support PEG. Many franchises, especially in large subscriber-rich systems, have a requirement that in addition to 5% franchise fee, cable operators provide funding for capital expenses. And again, Paul, the cost of building an institutional network and capital purchases to support it might be included right in the franchise. So there can be a lot of other sources. Now, the next bullet point I think could be controversial, and I need to explain it. In actually a little over half of the municipalities we looked at, jurisdictions we looked at, educational access channel operators receive no franchise-related funding. A model that you frequently see is that a community college or a K-12 school system will operate and program the channel, and they receive no additional funding. They support the programming on the channel. For some jurisdictions, especially when the operator is a college or a community college, some communities think that that's more fair because the distance learning programs that go out then via that channel are sources of tuition. Okay, so that said, that's the thinking of the ones who not fund the operators. But that said, we saw in our study a lot of unused education access channels. And in fact, one that we're working with right now in the Midwest, just the cable operator take their 2 educational channels back because there's nothing on them and the system is otherwise channel locked. So, again, what you see in great quantity is not always great quality. You have an educational consortium here who comes together and puts and programs your via the consortium your educational channels. Your educational channels are very rich with programming. So I'm not suggesting that the funding that comes from the commission is inappropriate. I'm only telling you that slightly over half of jurisdictions your size don't do it, and they leave it to the education service district to do it. One of the things we asked the local franchising authorities is, how do you approach evaluation criteria for PEG and funding criteria? In response to the question of the jurisdiction surveyed, we found no examples of criteria used as the basis for a zero-based funding allocation, except in year 1 startup year. So in other words, nobody that we could find is on an annual or biannual basis, starting from zero, saying, okay, who's going to do what and how should we allocate the money? We don't see. Where we found criteria frequently used was the basis for assessing the performance of the service provider and for selecting a service provider. Decisions of whether to have P, E, and G access and how much to fund we found is made on a broad and fundamental basis based on community values. And then specific needs, specific decisions about specific PEG services are based on community needs assessments. So we do have some suggestions to you about how you might approach this dividing up the funding pie here in Sacramento, but we do find a lot of zero-based guidance out there among your fellow jurisdictions.
The last 3 there are just another way of expressing the procurement model.
The procurement model is much more common, yes.
But that's just another way of phrasing it.
It kind of is, although to me the decision about whether or not to have PEG is almost the cable commission level, although you folks are elected officials, the commissions are not. They're citizen appointees like I am. And the decision of whether to have and how to fund PEG kind of gets made above our level. And then we're told, hey, we want to have PEG, and we really want you to do a lot on public access, or we really want you to do a lot on the government side. And then we kind of go based on those broad guidelines. And that's a frequently seen rule. Okay, most franchising authorities are one of two things. They're either a single unit of government, like a city or a county, or they are a joint powers, multi-jurisdictional network, such as yourselves. We had trouble finding good comparatives to Sacramento in joint powers, multi-jurisdictional framework, because most frameworks, such as yours, contract, or they're more likely to contract with a unified PEG service provider, one entity that manages the P, D, and G channels. Now, that said, making a transition from funding separately to funding in a unified approach is a tough transition. And even in my own town, where we believe it's a good approach, and we fund two separate sides, we have one side where we haven't been fully able to bring all of the P, E, and G together under one roof, just because of our history. So I'm not necessarily suggesting you do it, but I'm suggesting that others like you generally try to fund PEG and not get into a lot of squabbles about who gets what portion of the pie. Just focus on the PEG work to be done. We found no other jurisdiction with a community use channel required as a part of their franchise language, such as you have. We did jurisdictions that want community interest programming on their public access channel, but nobody else has such a segregated channel. And I want to point out that when we talked to other jurisdictions about your community use channel, the response we got from the channel managers was, holy crap, what does it cost them to program that channel? Because, of course, staff-produced programming is a heck of a lot more expensive to produce than volunteer-produced public access programming. And so we got on the phone to Access Sacramento, who informed us that 80% of their budget is dedicated to that community use channel. The other interesting thing was the segregation between religious programming, community use programming, and public access. You really don't see that in communities. You usually see all programming on the public access channels. I hope that you can see this, because this is a critical issue. This is just kind of some industry metrics that show national averages in the Smctc franchise area. The metrics are based on operating funds from all franchise-related sources. Two phrases I want you to notice. Number one, this is operating funds only. Most of the jurisdictions we look at receive other cable-related monies. Number two, this from all franchise-related, not just the franchise fees. But if you notice that for operations, the allocation per month per subscriber on the national average is 75 cents, and this franchise area is 45 cents. In terms of funding, the amount that it costs to produce a programming hour for government and public access, and there are not good records anywhere kept for education access, and I could tell you why if we want to go there. But the national average is almost $600 a programming hour. In Sacramento, the programming hour is the cost of programming hour is $195. You are getting a fat value equation here compared to other similar jurisdictions. And as you can see, public access and government access produce far more programming per year than is the national average. I'd like to just explain a little bit about educational access. The educational access service providers nationwide count programming hours in 4 distinctly different ways. And in a sample of 40, we could not draw any conclusions. That said, there's 6,100 hours of educational access programming produced in Sacramento. That is a lot of programming. So although I can't compare it based on numbers to what other educational access organizations do, I would feel sure that it's a good valuation. It's a lot of programming, especially since many of the jurisdictions we looked at have education channels that have almost nothing on them. So this really, and we had no agenda here. We just surveyed. We weren't out to show Sacramento in a good or bad light. It's just the way the numbers came out. So again, you have a strong value equation. Also, was another survey done by our company about 2 years ago for another client that examined the range of related services that are available in an area, and there's 36 services. And I think the average, you guys have 31 of those services. I think the national average was 24 services available. So your range of PEG-related services is high. The thing that I can't speak to, because I haven't done a needs assessment, is you're squeezing your value equation for all you can squeeze it for. And the degree to which that's impacting the quality of what people see on the screen, I cannot assess. However, I watched a little bit of the channels today. They look pretty good to me, and I watch them all over the country. But just to say, based on the data, you're getting a heck of a value equation. Before I go on to talk about best practices, I'd be happy to answer questions about the findings.
Questions?
We're a bunch today.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, well, then moving along in the process of assessing findings, we tried to identify some best practices that we can use to help structure a funding formula or funding criteria for Sacramento. And we looked at commonly employed practices that are emerging as industry practices and that were evaluated as most positive or favorable when jurisdictions were using them. And here's just here's the best practices that we determined. First of all, that PEG operational and capital funding would be allocated through a consistent mechanism and at specific levels, either through the franchise or the ordinance. In other words, value in funding stability to PEG. Generally, we found funding tied to increases in the performance of the cable operator or the consumer price index. Now, that said, this is an interesting issue here. In Portland, our PEG providers their increases are tied to the gross of the cable operator, performance of the cable operator. Our cable operator's gross was down last year for a variety of reasons, mainly relative to competition. But so there was less funding on the plate for our PEG provider. We chose out of another money to make them whole, but we did not have to. As our fortunes of mission go and the cable companies go, so do the PEG providers. And it makes for a healthy dynamic because it puts the three of us sort of all in it together. Another best practice is there being some franchise-related funding for PEG in addition to franchise fee funding. When all the funding for PEG has to come out of the general fund, it makes for very tough decision-making. And then another best practice, and you folks don't do this, where PEG is provided by a cable company, we found a lot of dissatisfaction. People tend to want to see PEG provided by separate entities other than the cable company. Speaking to the issue here, where service providers had contracts with agreed upon performance criteria, both the franchising authority and the PEG providers were happy with that situation, viewed it as positive. The LFA said, we know what we're getting for money, and the provider said, we know what's expected of them, what they're going to ask us about, come annual budget time. That, we think, is a best practice. For commission forms where there's multi-jurisdictions, as yourselves, those jurisdictions tend to like the unified PEG model where it can be established. And then for operating funds, recent PEG formulas are based on a range of 50 cents to $1 per subscriber in the jurisdictions we surveyed. And Sacramento was just below that low at 45 cents per subscriber. another best practice was funding for other cable-related services, but that's a franchise issue, and we'll set that aside. And then another piece that I think is pertinent to Sacramento, a best practice that we found in jurisdictions, particularly with modern franchises that were developed in the environment of modern technology, is that the public capacity on the system is expressed as a percentage of total capacity dedicated to public uses, not this channel for this and that channel for that. So in other words, typical language you would see in a franchise document would be, say on a digital system, the cable operator must provide up to 36 channels or 10% of the total system bandwidth, whichever is less. That's what you see now in modern franchises, other than this channel, 2 channels or public access.
But that is not an option for us at this point.
Right. It isn't an option, but to the degree to which you have control over your channels outside of your franchise, you might look at this model, because most jurisdictions are seeking to retain bandwidth flexibility when possible. So you may not be able to renegotiate it, but you have some control to seek more flexibility in the control channels. I hear what your concern was, Paul. I didn't mean to misstate what my point was. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about where we're kind of going and thinking about our recommendations. But so before we go there, questions?
Go ahead then, Sue.
That there's a couple of things that the Commission can do, including moving toward a more permanent-oriented model to begin to focus away from the concept of funding grantees toward a concept of funding or procuring public services for our jurisdictions. I think it'll benefit the Commission, and I think greatly benefit the grantees. And then, once that procurement model is established, then there should be goals and expectations that are reviewed on a periodic basis, as with any contract. And I'll talk about that later. We would recommend that however you choose to kind of reallocate bandwidth or resources, that then you establish a stable funding platform that will eliminate the potential for unproductive contention among providers and allow a stable platform for planning. Predictability is required for planning. And also, the provision of PEG services is not something you want to contract shop for 2 years. I hope that that's clear, that I'm not suggesting that you should, what you hopefully will do is establish a long-term partnership-oriented relationship with service providers. Our third recommendation concept is that we're suggesting that you fund PEG access at a rate that brings this franchise area closer into conformance with national averages for funding such services. Presently, you allocate 33.5%, at least in the last budget year, it was 33.5% of the total franchise fee to PEG. In the future, you might choose to increase funding for P, E, and G in some combination, and we'll talk about that later, while maintaining, while lowering even the percent of the total franchise fee. There's a potential win-win here. And then ultimately, to put things on a really more business-oriented, more modern footing, there needs to be some assessment of community needs, interests, and circumstances, so that then you can move to the procurement model, because you really understand what those services are you wish to purchase for your community. This again shows how some of the funding allocations, both for P, E, and G, and then the other services for which you contract. And as you can see, public access is underfunded by a little bit less than 1/3 according to the national average. Education access is slightly underfunded, but government access is significantly underfunded. Sacramento spends 8 cents per subscriber per month to procure government access services. Other similar jurisdictions spend on the average of 38 cents. Now, again, there may be circumstances that validate that. I mean, you may be more than on robotics than other jurisdictions. I mean, you may not have the expenses. You may have had a rich capital legacy that outfitted you well. We didn't assess that. And then the other services that you fund are not funded by other jurisdictions, so we couldn't give you a number on that. But you could bring your funding more in conformance, or closer to conform to the national average, and, not once you go below 5%, lower your total percentage of franchise fees allocated to PEG. Now, we understand that you may not to do that, and you may choose to keep the dollar amount stable, and we're prepared to craft a recommendation to you on the model by which you could do that. But it would really be our recommendation to bring PEG more toward the national average funding. Okay, concept number 4, I think, probably strikes to the heart of some of the funding to specific uses. But we believe that Sacramento ought to conduct a full review both of how it distributes funds and bandwidth for public uses, and either reassign or reconfigure the channel usage and funding. We would not recommend, based only on quantitative data, that you continue to fund PBS or NPR affiliates. And if you want to do so, we would recommend that they're linked to demonstrable community needs. A way to do that might be as a part of a plan or contract with your education service provider. Perhaps the PBS channel should be a part of that overall education access system, and there's many ways to do it. Unless you, being residents and leaders in Sacramento, know of a unique community need, I would suggest that you're doing something with very limited resources anyway that's outside the national norm. Also, we would suggest that you integrate religious and public access programming to maximize channel usage, and then also that you integrate the community use in the free speech public access channel. You've got scroll on channels, and you're locked on others. Education access also is approaching lock, and you're not fully utilizing other channels, and you've got no pattern right now for maximizing the use of that bandwidth. And as another part of that concept, we just recommend that we don't only pick on these segregated uses, but that the overall capacity needs of PE and G should be examined. Then that potential additional 30 megahertz that is in your franchise available to PEG should be a part of that evaluation. It should maximize it. And it shouldn't just go to one use or another. Waste of a precious resource. Okay, we came up with this because of an interest that we heard when we interviewed commission members and at the Media Access Roundtable. There was an interest in having some funds available for innovative programming. Franchise fee money is your money. In Portland, we get 1% of the gross for grants, but they have to be for capital purchases. We have no ability to fund program grants. But your franchise fee money is your money. And if you want to take some of it and just have it available as a grant pool to offer programming grants to meet the objectives, that might be viable. We heard an interest in both the roundtable and your interviews. Of course, the downside is that grants have to be administrated, and there's a cost to that, staffing. But you might consider it. This is a little bit outside what you asked us to do, but it occurred to us because it was mentioned so many times. And now we get to goals. You asked us to review your goals. We had the community roundtable review those goals. We've got their feedback, and we've got some both from the roundtable and from our own office on it. But before I go there, I just kind of dumped a whole bunch of thou shalt and thou shalt on you. Would anybody like to ask any questions before I roll into this next piece on your goals?
Okay, go ahead, Sue.
Let me hand these out, because I bet you, if you're like me, we have to ask our staff all the time on our commission, could you guess what our goals are?
Why am I here?
Vice presidential debates.
And again, you always feel a little presumptuous coming to somebody else's town and talking to them about town. But as I understand it, these goals were developed about 10 years ago. And as it was pointed out in the Community Media Access Roundtable, gee, the whole world has changed in 10 years. Who knew what a cable modem was 10 years ago? So it's probably, time to update them. The Community Media Access Roundtable suggested the following, that these goals be reviewed on a periodic basis so that they're responsive to changing community technology. There should be a goal about outreach. How's the community supposed to get involved in these goals? Was the question from the roundtable. So they said, have a goal about outreach, marketing, education about the channels, and how end users get involved. They said these goals sound tasky. What does it mean to the average citizen? They also commented at the roundtable that community diversity, expression of community needs and interest, diverse interest, should be addressed in the goals. The community diversity piece is not addressed in the goals. And then I gave them a sheet, which I will pass around to you here in a minute, that showed 4 form criteria that we found in our survey. And we asked them to evaluate which one they thought was the most appropriate in the Sacramento area. And they said an interesting thing. They said, gee, at the county, we went through this whole long thing of having quantitative measures for everything, and we found we were counting the wrong thing. So now we are trying to go to more qualitative measures, and we would encourage the commission to address qualitative performance evaluation criteria. So if I'm misspeaking, anybody who attended the meeting can correct me, but those were the things that we heard about the goals at the meeting. And looking at your goals, here are some things that we would suggest based on the table's recommendations and our office's review. If you look at the first 2 goals that have to do with public access, we recommend that different aspects of the public access mission, be it community interest, free speech, be articulated. What is it you want to create in the community? What's the opportunity? And that should be part of your goal. Government, same way. We're trying to foster in the community. And what's the scope of programming that you want to see available to the public? The education access goal, I don't have a whole lot to say about. Our office should address the broad spectrum of community education needs, which that goal does. Programming goal 5, 6, and 7, since we had needs assessment, we couldn't link it to any community need. We are not sure what those goals are, what value they are, because we're not familiar with the needs in the community. It would be presumptuous to us to even try to evaluate them. And then there's no expectations outlined in the goal for administration, and obviously that should happen. So I think this is probably a count work session. And I think these goals could be made without, I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I think that with some attention to the detail, that this is not a bad start on a suite of goals.
They're all funny.
And if you can indulge me a little bit later, and I probably can't see that thing that we handed out. If folks didn't bring their reading glasses, I can not really myself. But again, just before I roll, to me, goal setting is a local endeavor. I can't tell you what your goals ought to be. I could speak to them for my community maybe, but we can talk about the process of establishing them. And then, just so that you know, we few franchising authorities that we talked to had standalone goals such as you do. Most of them had to dig out their contracts with their PEG providers to find their goals, because that's where their goals were. They put what they want the provider to do in the community in the contract, and that's where you found the goals. I think it's great that you have your own suite of goals, but that's where others do. With regard to, well, let me forward here, because this is, we found 4 examples of different kinds of goals, and we'll probably be, we want to talk to you about kinds of goals or criteria that is most interesting to you. We found 4 kinds of criteria used to evaluate PEG services in jurisdictions. We found basic contractual agreements only. Things like maintain accounting records, have these in practices. Jurisdictions had these tended to say goals, criteria, what goals and criteria? Of our contract language. Then there's also the objectives or scope of service statements, much similar to what you have, which talk about what you want the provider to do, like manage programming transmission, conduct outreach, conduct media literacy workshops. The second kind. The third type of criteria goals we found is outcomes-based qualitative. So in other words, here are the things that we want to see happen in the community. We want people to be able to use media competently. We want PEG to be broad valued in the community. We want diversity of programming. We want civic dialogue. And then the fourth criteria that we found tended to be more narrow outcomes-based goals, such as make facility equipment available at least 40 hours per week. Conduct at least 100 hours media education training per month. We found multiple jurisdictions use one or the other or some combination of these. And based on what we heard at the roundtable, our discussions with the grantees, and our own evaluation, we believe that these more narrow the more broad outcomes-based goals and criteria memorialized in PEG provider contracts and evaluated on a periodic basis is the method that's best for ongoing evaluation of funding. Now, in terms of the original question you posed to my company, which was how do we divide up the pie now, we would recommend that you bring your funding formula proportionally closer to national funding amounts, if not at the average, somewhat closer to, and that you look at the proportion of you allocate the funding, particularly towards government access, which is dramatically underfunded. On the other hand, we have an educational consortium, and many jurisdictions don't have that. We also have a community use channel that's expensive to program, and those things should be factored. But the one that jumps out at us is the underfunding of government programs. And I don't want to sound like a value judgment or a qualitative judgment. It's simply a quantitative numbers judgment. But if you look at the funding that goes to PBS affiliate, it's darn close. It's about within $40,000 of the funding that you put into government programming. Now, you spend 25% of what other jurisdictions spend for government programming, yet you fund to the tune of almost $200,000 a PBS affiliate that almost no one else funds. So, we would probably simply not base community need, and I need to stress that, but simply based on the quantitative facts, we would probably make some kind of recommendation for a reallocation of the pot across P and G to make you look more like jurisdictions nationwide. Now, Paul said, don't solidify your thinking, because you might hear something that you need to hear about our needs and interests before you go writing a report. So I just wanted to let the commission know the conclusions that we were starting to draw, but again, we don't have the advantage of a need assessment or your understanding of your community. So in summary, we think that the SMCTC gets good value for its PEG dollar by any kind of quantitative, any way we can tease those numbers out. We think it is likely PEG underfunding is impacting either production values or the scope that PEG's able to address. We think the grantee and entitlement orientation needs to be professionalized and transitioned to a contractor, contractee, and hopefully partnership basis. We think PEG funding should look more like national averages, if not be commensurate with it, because we understand that you have those additional funding streams that other jurisdictions have. We think that funding for specific dedicated uses such as, or channels assigned, such as the PBS affiliate, a segregated religious channel, a segregated community use channel, are not justified by survey findings. We think that funding and capacity allocation should be based on community needs and interests, but that bandwidth flexibility should be fostered and it should be maximized because it's a precious resource. And we should establish outcome-focused goals. We think you should have contracts with your service providers and then require the service providers to conduct periodic needs assessments, probably every 2 years, have a business plan for addressing those needs and interests, and have their business plans also linked to the Commission's goals. And then those business plans should be reviewed and updated and monitored by the Commission on a periodic basis. So that is the drift of our thinking. And this quote-unquote report exists today in a bunch of sticky notes, pages, and ideas strung all over my office. I have deliberately not said these are our recommendations because I am interested in hearing what missed that is about having to do with the needs and interests of your community. But simply based on the quantitative evidence, these would be the kind of recommendations we would give you. Thank you for that, for your time and patience with a very long presentation.
On behalf of the Commission, Sue, I'd like to thank you for summarizing it. And
so sorry.
I think in relationship to the number of hours that you put in this thing, that you summarized it very well, and I like Mr. Hahn's idea. You got all these pasty stickies, as you say, all over your office until we get our input into it. So with that, I've got a few ideas myself, but we'll call on the Commission for any ideas they may have. You can get a copy of this tape, maybe, rather than take notes, and see where we're coming from to make your final report.
I will make sure, too, we have copies of this today, but we'll get copies of the PowerPoint to each of the commissioners tomorrow, as well as to the PEG groups, so that, this isn't the last chance in the next few days. Obviously, as people have had a chance to think about this, specifically the PEG groups, it's not really fair to put them on the spot right now and say this is the last chance to make comments. So we'll try and get that to them as quickly as we possibly can. Maybe we can even get it today so that they have a couple days to look at it, and then we have obviously can get comments either written or through phone calls to Sue, and they certainly can testify today.
I think this is such an important issue. I think that's a good point, Paul, but I also think that before the final report comes out, there should be one more meeting amongst the PEG groups or via telephone or whatever to get their final input on a one-to-one basis for your final analysis. That, Mr. Yee?
Thank you. I think one of the smartest comments I heard during this past hour is the comment made by Mr. Paul, and that was, don't solidify your recommendations yet. And I think that's a smart move because there's a lot of what's going on. I appreciate your report. I would love to have a full copy so that I can digest it more. It's the first time I've heard it. But looking at some of the numbers, the national average, 75 cents an hour per subscriber or whatever it is. If we bring it up to 75 cents per subscribers, and how many subscribers are there? 250,000? I don't know. Is it, anyone know what the round number is?
I don't know, do we?
What? Let's use 250,000.
I think it's a little lower than that. I think it's 230, 240. I'm not
240?
positive.
Somewhere close to
241,371 is what I have in my notes, John.
All right. But that was on a monthly basis? Per month? That's 75 cents per hour per subscriber per month. And we're only at 45 cents an hour right now.
Right.
And means we contribute about 1.4 million or 1.3 something per year to our grant?
Correct, to all the PEG groups, correct.
Yeah, to PEG groups, which means if we bump it up to 7 cents, just using rough averages or ratios, to kick in another, say, 900,000 approximately.
One of the things that Sue points out, and probably the folks at Channel 14, probably a large majority of that would go for the G side, is what apparently seems to be so unfit. And quite frankly, I'm not sure what we would do with that amount of increase right off the bat.
That's what I was coming to.
Now, the E and the P people may think different. I mean, and again, I'm sure you give us the money, we'll figure out a way to split it. But I think we would, again, a needs assessment. Is Channel 14 serving the need? I mean, I certainly think there's things that we could look at, live coverage at in Citrus Heights and things of that sort, but I'm not sure that, that much of an increase.
Yeah. But a big part of that is this from 8 cents to 38 cents or whatever it is in this channel. And so I kept asking myself the question, if we put in another 30, that brings it up from 45 to 75, but we're also underfunded in the government channel by about that same amount. And so the question I have is, do we need that much more for the government channel? I don't think we do. It's been going along pretty good. I haven't heard many complaints about. I know there's one complaint that the Board of Supervisors supersedes a city council meeting Tuesday afternoon for us.
As it should be.
Commissioner,
that's the only complaint I've heard. But
excuse me for not touching that.
We would agree that the best way to do it. We tried to respond to the Commission's question. What is an objective way to divide up the pie? What is an objective criteria? And I couldn't sit in my office in Portland and tell you my opinion. That wouldn't have been objective. So we looked to see what other organizations are doing. But I would absolutely agree that the right way to do it would be to spend the time to do the community needs assessment and make some decisions, not only about how you want to assign funds, but how you want to assign the channel capacity, the bandwidth. And make your decision based on that. And I would, and that decision might look much different than that purely quantitative information that I gave you. And I would absolutely agree with that.
Well, bottom line is I look at bringing ourselves up to the average, but at the same time I'm asking myself, do we need it? Because I see a big chunk of it, 30 cents in the government channel area. It's so large that it's very obvious.
One other thing I would say is that keep in mind that other communities have additional revenue streams other than just franchise fees. And in light of that, I wasn't suggesting that to come up to the national average is the right thing for Sacramento.
That was one other question I had, and every city has different circumstance and condition than the city of Sacramento has, and that's not a known, because I'm so sure I remember you telling us if this city has $1 per subscriber per month, what kind of resources have that we don't have? Mm-hmm. So it's hard to just say let's go from our expense to the national average without having some feeling for what that national average consists of.
Right, I would agree.
Okay, that's it. Without belaboring anything.
Yeah. I just wanted to make a couple of comments because I realize that when you're looking at the situation here is in many ways very different, and I think that relates back to the settlement agreement and how the initial franchise came about in terms of the proposer that got the franchise set the system up, and through the settlement agreement inherited it. And I appreciate your comments about how to get to there. But I also wanted to comment that I think you did a good job in telling us, okay, this is what other jurisdictions do, without making any qualitative judgment as to whether that makes the system better or not. Just because a lot of doing it that way doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. And that we should try to stick to those norms or not, because you do have to look at your own community. What I would be interested in is what type of process do these jurisdictions use to do a needs assessment themselves, and how much that costs. Mechanism do they use to get information about those community needs? And then are they really measuring the type of programming that, let's take Portland, for example. Does Portland really measure consumer satisfaction based on the type of contracts that they let from year to year? And if so, how do they do it? Because I think if we're trying to figure out what are our needs, are we meeting those needs given the constraints of this system, what are some of the mechanisms to do that, and costs, and how do we measure any outcomes? So, in simple terms.
Yeah. Well, we do two different kinds of assessments. One we do every other year, and that's we require our providers our service providers to conduct their own needs assessments and a business plan. And that's a pretty common model.
But how do they do this?
Well, generally telephone surveys where people are asked about the kinds of programming that could be valuable and what kinds of programming they'd be interested in. And then generally you look at stakeholder groups and you either survey them or you bring them together to talk about what they need to use the system for. And those groups would be government, public safety agencies, hospitals, nonprofits, ethnic communities. So you identify, usually you work with a steering committee, you identify what local sectors are in the city, you do outreach to them, you either focus groups, surveys, or interviews, get their input, you do some past performance audit, and then you summarize your results. And generally it's the provider level, and then on a much more infrequent basis, the commission will really undertake one of their own. It's it's a very community intensive project. You have to go right out to the people who actually use the resources. By sector, business communities usually involved. We could send you example documents if that would help, but you could look at what one looks like.
Okay, I'd like to do that. I have to confess, while I'm in Portland, maybe once a year, I don't watch television while I'm there, so I have no idea what's available. But
I think a lot of communities probably have done needs assessments that we can, look at and try and get copies of or something. I'm not aware that this community has done a needs assessment in regards to PEG in at least the last decade or more. So, that is certainly another direction that you could go towards, to do a study and look at the needs and also look at the criteria, after that time. That certainly is another direction, though certainly that would not be completed in time for kind of budget analysis this year.
No, I'm thinking that given the system we have, with the limited amount of, whether you call them channels, when you talk about bandwidth, it's limited. While we have schools have some ability to use an INET. I don't know of other public institutions do. So that's probably one of those big, gaping, unmet needs out there that I don't know how we would accomplish that at this point. But there are, I just think it would be very helpful for us to really understand how you would go about doing that. And as I say, it'd be difficult to try to compare the system that we do have and how to evolve it into anything that's out there, because I just can't make a judgment as to whether what they're doing is any better than what we're doing. And
Yeah.
so,
Commissioner Collin, if somebody was going to do a credit needs assessment for you, they wouldn't be assessing needs for resources like ICE that you don't have a provision to get in your franchise. So what usually happens is the universe of what's studied is limited to what's possible. And,
that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, right.
And I suppose
right.
that would be really are the channels that are out there that are on the air now really meeting the needs of the community? Is the educational channels, what is the need of the community, and are they satisfying that need? Is Channel 14, what is the need? I mean, for example, is there a large need out there for people to watch special district meetings or community meetings or planning commission meetings, which we currently in a number of cases don't televise? If we did a need assessment and determined that there is a great need that people want to watch their park district meetings, then we are not meeting that need. Typically speaking, that would be a basis for you to, allocate funds to more government to supply that. I suppose that is, I think what you would find out in that type of analysis, and that's just one example.
Okay, and I have one last question, because I think I understand what you meant by the difference between entitlement and going to a different system because of the, again, legacy, which is a good word. The system we sort of inherited after the settlement really had that type of a system built in. But I think that we do have the flexibility, complete flexibility regarding those channels, those 7 channels, and I still think of it in terms of channels, to figure out what you would like to do. I think we do have the mindset of entitlement, and that's why we spend so much time on just figures in a budget rather than thinking about it in another way.
Yeah. It doesn't serve the service providers. They provide a valuable service, and it would serve everybody, the providers and the commission, to professionalize that relationship.
Thank you. Before I call Mr. Gore, I'd just like to follow up on Ms. Cole's points there a little bit. And I fully understand that that wasn't part of the RFP to look at our local needs here, per se, as has been discussed. But hindsight being 20, I really wonder, and I realize there's not time to do it now, but I just do not feel complete, whatever report comes back, complete satisfaction as to what our local needs are going to be as far as P versus E versus G type things. And I was somewhat, unless I understood you, you said you couldn't speak to the PEG channels as you had watched them. Is that true? Did I hear you say that at your opening statement? You'd only watched a minute in her office? Is that what you said?
Yeah, right.
I don't understand that part. If you came to do a survey for us, why you wouldn't spend some time looking at what we have to offer to these different channels?
I went to my hotel room when I was here. I mean, we weren't commissioned to do kind of...
How can you make an assessment if you aren't even aware of what PE is really all about in Sacramento, and especially in your position as a commissioner? I don't understand that part of it.
Well, we did feel that it was a part of the RFP or our proposal to make any kind of a qualitative evaluation of the programming. I mean, we know what you have in your channel. We've seen your lineup cards. We've seen your programming schedules. We see what the look is of the channel, but weren't hired to do any kind of a needs assessment.
And I qualified that earlier for RFP, but I just find myself in the position I'm going to evaluate Monday Night Football versus CBS on Sunday afternoon to make some kind of a judgment that I would look at both of them, at least for now. That's that's the only shortcoming I see in your report here.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, the recommendations in my report and the way things shake out nationally aren't necessarily my opinion of what I would do if I was queen.
I understand that, but we were looking for, I thought when we went into this process that Mr. Trump suggested that we would have a more quantitative substance. Of course, we haven't seen your final report, but that's just a comment. Mr. Gore, would you have a few things you'd like to speak to?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you. I was really educated, and I feel that you're a very knowledgeable subject, and so I enjoyed
also think that you managed to walk through a potential minefield without breaking any eggs or hurting anyone's feelings, one way or the other. At least I hope you didn't. I wanted to get the math rate in my head as to what percentage we're using when we refer to numbers. Obviously, there's a 5% figure, and there's an 8% figure. So, in Sacramento's concern, are you dealing with just the 5% figure that we have, or what other agencies have, additional 3?
Well, it's a little bit complicated, so give me a minute to explain it. When I referenced the other kinds of funding that jurisdictions get, I did so mainly just to explain that other PEG organizations have other streams of money. Usually they are tied to capital expenditures. You're prohibited from using them for operating because you can't ask the cable operator anymore to provide operating funds. So my answer to your question is a little bit yes and no. What we looked at was the total of all franchise-related funds dedicated to operating expenses. Now, some jurisdictions do have some other streams of money dedicated to operating expenses. They may have an old franchise that hasn't expired, or they may just have an agreement outside of what they could require from the cable, where the cable company provides it. But most jurisdictions are providing the operating funds out of franchise fees because they can't get it from the cable operator anymore. Now, that said, most PEG organizations are not buying equipment out of those operating funds. The reason is they have capital funds from another source. In Sacramento, your PEG organizations, to a great degree, have to make their capital purchases out of that total grant amount. Other communities are viewing that as operating money because franchises give more capital money than the PEG organizations can almost spend. I'm sorry that was complicated, but if I can clarify it more, I'd be happy to.
I think it's something we have to really, understand.
Right. Well, so the short answer is that because you can't get operating money from the cable company anymore, most 75 cents is funded out of franchise fees because there ain't any other operating funds out there.
And this is 2024.
Well, these are franchises that, right.
In our case, it would,
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Gore? Susan? No? Roger?
Yes, thank you. First of all, your presentation enlightened me and made me think, so I really appreciate that. And it was rather lengthy, and the lights were down, and I didn't hear any snoring. So, congratulations.
Little victories, huh?
I am intrigued by the notion of this INET, the institutional network. I realize there isn't a provision for it, but it's a matter of resources and bandwidth. And if we are talking, I'm oversimplifying this, and I'll for the moment not be held back by constraints, just to try to think creatively. If we are talking about reallocating or reassessing the utilization of bandwidth resources, then that ought to be an entirely open and not restricted just to what we've dedicated those bandwidth resources to in the past. But I had never heard the phrase institutional network, but with a little bit of thought, we could come up with some extremely effective and valuable ways of implementing that sort of technology within our public institutions here in Sacramento County. And I'm very, very intrigued by that notion. A light bulb went on for me when you talked about the procurement model versus the entitlement model. I haven't been at this very long, just 2 years now. I've been on this commission, and I think I was jumping on a moving train, and I was at the caboose, and there's no way I could get to the locomotive to figure out how they were driving this thing. And I suppose Mr. Jones felt the same way, which is why he really suggested we go through this process. But that was a very concept was extremely enlightening to me, and it answered the question for me as to why I'm uncomfortable with the way that we're doing it. The procurement model does make a lot of sense in terms of how we address the application of these scarce but very valuable public resources. I'm not particularly swayed one way or another by the quantitative part of the analysis. I really don't care at the outset whether we spend per subscriber quite a bit less than the national average. It may be an indication that we're more economic with the funds available. And after all, these bills are being paid by the people that are watching these tubes out there, and I think we have to be certainly mindful of that. And if we're getting good value for our money, that's okay without just raising the bar. And perhaps raising the bar could be looked at by implementing some other things that we haven't done before, like an institutional network as an example. But what I'm really interested in before I think about that is what do people out there think about what we're doing? It is just an issue of needs assessment, although that's part of it, but it's an assessment of what people think about what we're doing currently. What do people think about the sorts of programming that's offered by B and the E and the G, and with the satisfaction of existing offerings, what does that suggest? How would questions be answered relative to what other things people might like to see? And that effort hasn't been made since I've been here, and I suspect it's never been made. And it occurs to me, gosh, that seems so fundamental. You're a service provider. You got to find out what your customers think. We have all segments of our community at various levels. We need to address that question. Keep in mind various segments of the community, but nonetheless, that's a fundamental question. And I can't even begin to assess whether the fact that we spend 45 cents and the national average is 75 cents, I can't even begin to address whether that's a good or a bad thing unless I know that. So those were the things that really caught my attention in the presentation. And by the way, with regard to increased resources toward the governmental part of it, Paul, you made a comment. I don't know where we'd spend if we got it, but I know one thing is the live broadcast of some of the larger jurisdictions in our region. I think would be tremendous if added. We currently are tape delay on Citrus Heights and on Folsom and on Elk Grove, and these are very large jurisdictions in our region that we ought to think about the capability. That's capital expenditure, and it's probably big bucks. But that's one thing that I could think right off the bat that increased allocation sources for the government a portion could be.
Commissioner, one thing that I would like to point out is that I'm not an engineer, so I can't tell you whether or not you can convert your existing channel configuration to the kind of two-way system that would be required for any kind of, institutional linkage. Pretty much PEG just runs in one direction down out of the operator's head end, and an iNet is a completely different configuration. If you're interested in, what you might be able to do with the bandwidth available to you, I mean, that's an engineer's question. An engineer could tell you that. But I would guess that what you've got now probably not convertible into that kind of a two-way high-capacity system.
I'm not an engineer, too, and it's a good thing I'm not, because if I concluded that, I would have never brought the point up.
Yeah.
But I think it's an important...
I just didn't want to leave a misconception.
I understand.
But I think that to have, to do a reassessment of, how can we maximize our public capacity is a good thing. Absolutely.
Hey, Mr. Jones?
I want to thank you as well. I thought the presentation was very interesting and helpful, if for no other reason than it gave us a window into what's going on elsewhere, and I think sparked some thought on all of our part with regard to what we might do in terms of how we approach the operation of this commission and its relationship with the PEG provider. On the INEP point, I think that is a fascinating idea, and I've only been commissioned for about a year and a half, but if I've got the history right, and I think Paul and Harriet can correct me if I go off course, but I think there was initially intended an institutional network of some sort of dedicated network, and then that got negotiated away for the 30 megahertz of bandwidth, which is a yet fulfilled commitment by the franchisee, which I might also note parenthetically is supposed to be two-way bandwidth. And
right.
Because of the value of it is something that obviously is important to us, and that's why we reaffirmed our commitment to obtaining that in the context of the franchise transfer. And obviously the value of it and the potential implications it has for the franchisee's ability to deploy certain two-way services that it wants to deploy, because there's only a certain portion of the spectrum that can be used, as I understand it, for this sort of two-way communication. It's limited. It's not infinite, and so consequently, it's a scarce resource over which we are going to have, I think, some interesting discussions with our franchisee, which, if we can't come to resolution on, set up a mechanism for binding arbitration. So do I have that right?
You have the process right. As far as our ability to, the previous negotiation, that's...
Ms. Collins might remember, because what happened with an institutional network back in the original negotiations and the original settlement agreement.
That's just based discussions I've had with the Ed Consortium and others, based on their understanding of what they thought was going to be delivered at the time the franchise was first created, and then subsequent negotiations. But in any event, we've got this 30 megahertz out there. It's it functionally, I think it's the equivalent of what you're describing, and it is very dear to us. And it is something that has tremendous, and something I think we want to ensure is available to the public access and education folks. Second, I mean, I think it is interesting to know, and in some ways it's very affirming to know, you know, where we stand vis-a-vis the national averages and what that means in terms of the per dollar value provided, or the programming provided for the amount of dollar investment we make. I mean, we know we've got very good providers. There's been no dispute with regard to that. The issue for us, though, was when we make these decisions about the allocation of scarce resources, how do we do it? How do we know what value we're getting? I'm not convinced that using a national average is any less arbitrary than saying, well, we're going to use your budget by 10% or 20% or 30%, particularly where we don't know, and this would be interesting, something I'd like you to also try to provide us at some point. We don't really know what percentage of the revenues that are being provided by these other LFAs, well, what additional sources of funds they have, and what it means when you measure the amount they provide to the providers versus the amount that they actually have. Does that make it? I mean, you look to, in some cases, LFAs have 3% of the operating costs of the franchisee. So for them, providing 75 cents on a dollar, it means something different than for us, where we're just constrained at 5% of the franchise, collecting 5% of the franchise, or having a fee of 5% on the franchise. Did that make sense? I'm not articulating that very clearly.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that's what I was trying to say, that you know, that we all need to acknowledge that some of these jurisdictions got more money flowing into PEG, and that they aren't having to make capital purchases out of franchise fee money because they get capital money from the cable company. But that's the reason that we only try to look at operating money. But you could almost turn it around, Commissioner Jones, because in a way, what happens? Suppose, just say, let's take a city like, well, let's take any city that gets capital money. Let's take Seattle. Seattle gets a fairly large amount every year from the cable operator for capital, and then operations is did out of franchise fees. Now let's say Seattle gives about 50 cents per month per sub, as Sacramento does. There's still a lot more operating in Seattle because they don't have to make any capital purchases out of the money that they operate. In Sacramento, pretty much all that is available to the PEG operators is the franchise fee money. You've got to fund operations and capital. So even though you say it's 50%, 50 cents out per month per sub out of the general fund, in Sacramento, you got to make that money go. You got to buy more things with it. So even though the number can be the same on the surface, it's not.
And maybe that's my point. Difficult to do sort of an apples-to-apples comparison between what we do here and what the other jurisdictions are doing, which is then averaged into this national average. I mean, that's the problem. And then I'm at that point I'm sort of adrift because I think I'm still looking for some sort of metric to use in making these important decisions. And maybe what it comes down to is your sort of final points, which is ultimately the only way to do that is to have an understanding of what the community wants. And that wasn't a part of your charge, and I don't think you're not doing that is any reflection on you or your company. We didn't ask you to do that, but maybe that's what we need to do in order to be able to have a more coherent discussion and ability to decide about how much money we're going to put and how much money we're going to put between different providers. I'm not excited about upping the government provision because I'm just not convinced yet that there's a lot of demand for it. And I mean, I guess I could be persuaded if we did this needs analysis and we saw that there was demand for it, but I'm not sure that if that's where the money should go. I think there's a lot of community interest and demand for public access and education, though. But again, we don't really have a good way of measuring that.
Senator Jones, I agree that the right way to do this is get a professional assessment of community needs, get a better assessment of community needs, and then allocate your funding accordingly. Make a stable base then. Say, okay, for X number of years, we're going to allocate funds in this way. But what we tried to do was respond to what we thought was the question, which was how do we carve up the pie? And we don't think that there is any other objective criteria out there except to study what other like jurisdictions do and make some assumptions based on that.
But the other objective criteria that's presented as a way to judge proposals, and again, I'm not sure it gets back to the need, is sort of her fourth set of criteria. You could tell us that, we want so many hours of this kind of programming on access. We want, this much quality in some kind of technical manner. You can give me some criteria that we can judge when a proposal comes in. Again, the problem is that also meets, from a staff angle, I got something I can measure, and that's going to make life a lot easier for the staff, but I'm not sure it gets again to several of the comments as to is that meeting the community and what they want. Because we put 800 hours of some programming out there that met some criteria, but does anybody want the 800 hours or what it is? And I think I'm looking at this as we go along and ask, and thinking how am I going to use this as criteria. And my theory is that we've got this very objective kind of criteria that sure helps a whole heck of a lot, or we have this other set of very specific criteria that also doesn't really get to whether the community is served. It's frustrating to get to try and address this issue without getting into value judgments of what does the community want or what do you want as individual commissioners.
Okay. Mr. John. Mr. Shelby.
Stand up there.
First of all, am I on?
Yep.
Let me thank you for your presentation. I thought it was very thought-provoking and intriguing in terms of the procurement model. In terms of other jurisdiction, how do you expand opportunities? For instance, I've always had an interest in seeing diversity in the region expand in terms of broadcasting on cable. But sometimes you see programming that's quantity to fill time, but sometimes quality isn't there. So I think the need assessment is needed so we can determine what people in the region feel is really needed to be seen. And so that as we do that, we expand opportunities. I think there are organizations that would love to get their message across on cable, but they don't have necessary training to do that. And so I think opening up the windows of opportunity would give other organizations a chance to not only get their message out, but to offer some additional quality programming and really showing off diversity in the region. And so how do you go about a needs assessment, and what is the time frame that normally takes?
So first question, how do you consider regional diversity in assessment? Doing a needs assessment is a very sort of cookie step-by-step process, just from the process standpoint. And generally what you do is you work with an advisory committee that's representative, usually elected officials appoint some members to an advisory committee. They identify who the stakeholders and communities of interest and ethnic communities are, and they find a host in each of those communities who can sponsor your outreach community, and you do specific and targeted outreach into those identified communities. And the commission would identify the communities, nor would the consultant. That needs to be done by more steering committee. Usually it's about 6 or 7 people that participate in just defining the scope. And outreach to defining what those communities are and then putting an outreach plan together for them is one of the heart and souls of an assessment.
And I do believe that there is a need to expand the government programming, because I think community needs to see Citrus Live as opposed to Sacramento City all the time. Mr. Jones?
He's not live. He's leaving.
The other question, in terms of the, one more question I had, and I lost my train of thought. But if we did the needs assessment, is that a 6-month period of time?
That was your other question. Yeah. Yeah, it's at least a 6-month period of time, because the process is that you identify the stakeholder groups, and then you do an outreach plan for them, and then you set up your meetings, interviews, or surveys, conduct them, and then compile them. So 6 months is about your minimum time frame, and it's mainly because just marshaling the involvement of all those people takes a lot of time. The compiling the data, once it's developed, is not a time-consuming thing.
And you made another comment earlier about PBS stations not being funded typically.
Well, not with PEG-related funds. When we looked at, well, first of all, when we looked at PEG, at franchise-related funds, they were typically not funded through those sources, nor were they typically funded from franchise fees. Now, obviously, your franchise fees are your general fund money. You can do whatever you want with that money, including fill potholes or hire cops, or, that's your money to do with as you please. We just haven't seen that viewed as a pot of money from which PBS affiliates are funded. And again, not to say that you might not have an important reason to do it in Sacramento. We were just pointing out that we only found a jurisdiction that does so.
And how other cities, do you have any demonstration of how other cities are using the bandwidth opportunities?
A lot. But again, a lot of folks have more modern franchises. Again, the cities who were early entrants into cable and got the pre-84 Act franchises and have had to live with many of those traditions haven't done as well as the later franchised cities. So, but a lot of different models to how those resources are used.
Mr. Dickinson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. As most here know, I have held nothing but unbridled enthusiasm for this work from the beginning. And
and Dave isn't here.
I don't have to, without faulting your efforts, Sue. I must say that the presentation this afternoon has reinforced that bedrock of enthusiasm I've had all along for this. There are a lot of comments that are searching for a way out here, but I'm going to contain most of them and just try to make a couple of points. First of all, given your description of the procurement model, frankly, I don't see functionally a lot of difference necessarily between that and what you call the entitlement model. In fact, if we so chose, we could define some performance criteria, whatever they might be, and administer those in a non-contractual form in our review of grantees every year. There's nothing that prevents us from doing that in making funding decisions. Secondly, I think there's nothing wrong by any stretch of the imagination of conducting a needs analysis. I have to tell you, I don't know that we need to do this study to decide needs analysis might be something that we would like to do. But that aside, it seems to me that we have to keep in mind anytime we're talking about a needs analysis that part of what we do, particularly with access, but with PEG in general, is try to meet an audience which may not exist in any great numbers and may not be reflected to any great extent in needs analysis. In fact, it may be, in some instances, a speaker for whom there is no audience to identify when the speaker speaks. And that's an important value that place on the opportunity to have public access in our constellation of opportunities through this particular medium. So the notion that we will find through a needs assessment a route to identify the means of providing programming for an audience, I think, can only at best be partially met. That doesn't then suggest that a needs assessment is without value or merit. But frankly, we hear from our grantees 5 or 6 times a year. They tell us what they're doing, they're aiming their programming at, how they're spending their money, all those things that on those occasions and others, I'm sure, if so chose, we could inquire even more deeply into exactly how they decide to program, what they decide to program, and how they go about getting resources to do that. Thirdly, I don't think that, in all candor, we've made much progress so far in identifying these elusive standards, criteria that were the object, as I distilled it from the comments made by commissioners at the outset of this study. Now, Sue, you have provided what you have described as 4 categories of examples of different kinds of criteria, ranging from simply what I would call accounting for business practices to some that, frankly, make me nervous. But the truth is that while we've had a very good presentation today and a pleasant discussion, we haven't moved, as far as I can tell, an inch toward deciding whether we're going to settle on any of these or not. At the earliest, we would do that next month. So in conjunction with that, my final point would be simply this. I hope that this commission will not again hold these grantees hostage in terms of their operations until this commission decides what it wants to do with this subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Ms. Collin had a point for staff.
I love to listen to my fellow supervisors.
Which one?
Roger or Roger?
Both were to my
Don't
left
forget Don.
today.
This was supposed to be a caretaker 10% job, as I recall. When
Done,
Well, this is the what is it, the thicket? It was the thicket you can get into. I did have one observation to make, and you mentioned it somewhere in some material today. And it's always been a real sore point for me, is that we do not have an effective way to reach the cable subscribers with programming that would show all of the programming for the PEG channels. And to me, if I were going to put something on a priority that needs to be funded and we need some way to get it out there, would be that. Because at one point, we were trying to get them all at least on one page so that we knew what everybody was, how they were programming, what's going on, and we were trying to get that into more wide circulation. What we really need to do is get it to the cable subscribers. They're the ones who are paying the bill in terms of their subscription per month. And yet, on the rare times I ever get to be home to watch television, and I look at that great galaxy of channels that we have, and there is absolutely nothing on any channel I want to watch, regardless of how many they've got. unless PBS is running a good program, it's wasteland out there. The PEG channels are providing some really interesting niche programming. And it would be great if we could come up with a budget and the cooperation of our cable operator. How do we get this into the hands of the people who are paying the bill? I don't know how other communities are solving this. Our local newspaper won't do it. They will run 7. They run the one PEG channel. They will do the PBS one, so that there is an alternative that we can find at least what Channel 7's doing. But they don't run it for the government channel. They don't run it for the education channels. They don't run it for the religious channel or access channels. And so if you want to know what that is, you've got to wait for the scroll to go by, or you have to somehow get it independently from each of the PEG providers. I think that one thing this committee could do is look at, what's it going to cost us, and how do cooperation of the cable operator. And I think we'd get a heck more feedback, and if people knew some of the marvelous programming was out there.
It's the number one complaint about the PEG channels that when we survey consumers that we hear in any jurisdiction. The problem is the regionalization of both the broadcast and the cable lineups, that there's pre-developed, pre-printed programming scheduling that doesn't accommodate local programming. But I would absolutely agree with you. If nationally, if we solve that problem for PEG, we would move PEG forward an order of magnitude, and I think they nail right on the head.
And I would hope that we could explore that, what it would cost. You just need to do it on a monthly basis. I subscribe to KVIE and get the program guide, so that I figure out and I can read descriptions of it, and so I know what's coming the whole month.
We can certainly work with the cable company and find out what the cost of what that would be to send something.
I'd rather get
like
that in my cable bill than some of the other stuff I get in my cable bill. So.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, thank you for your presentation. And the second speaker will be Linda Martin.
Good afternoon. My name is Linda Martin, and I'm chair of the Board of Directors for the Sacramento Educational Cable Consortium and administrator in San Juan Unified School District. I'm here today to address the concerns of Smctc in regards to the funding criteria for the community programmers. During the past 2 annual funding cycles, the Commission has complimented the community programmers on their accomplishments and recognized the importance of community programming. Unfortunately, the Commission did not provide for funding increases to grantees. The reason given was that the Commission staff did not provide grant budget analysis, and there was a lack of Commission-approved evaluative criteria. This discussion has been ongoing by the Commission for over 2 years, and we understand this is the reason why the Commission sought out management resources to develop the criteria. This year, the Commission will have an unexpected additional $3.5 million in franchise fees as a result of the AT&T transfer. If evaluative criteria is going to be the basis of its funding for the grantees, then the expeditious development of this is imperative. SCCC is concerned that this opportunity for the city programmers to receive a portion of the additional $3.5 million might be lost because the revised policy will not be in place. On January 10th of this year, a community media access roundtable was held, and it was facilitated by Sue Disciple. Although we were invited to attend, we left there very concerned because we still do not have a clear understanding of what the criteria will be. Therefore, SCCC is very interested in how it might facilitate the Commission's criteria development process to assure that education and other community programmers not miss out on this once-in-a-franchise opportunity. We're very confident that we could satisfactorily address any accountable outcomes that are developed. We are also willing to assist with the development of performance standards. As a matter of fact, we have developed a draft of standards that include 5 major areas, which include proposed use of the channel, identification of community added value, other services, and an evaluation component. We would be happy to submit a draft of these to you or work with you in the next few weeks to develop other criteria. We know that we are a model for other community providers, and we are extremely proud of the programming that we presently have in place. We also know that with increased resources, we can reach many community members who could benefit from our educational opportunities. These are people who are unable to access traditional educational options because of their work schedules, childcare issues, transportation barriers, and economic and cultural circumstances. I would like to say this request is not about the grantees. It's about meeting the needs of this community and reaching currently underserved individuals and families. And this is Sue's goal number 6 of meeting a broad spectrum of community needs. We touch the lives of thousands of our residents every day, from the new arrived immigrants who are seeking language skills to the college students who need teleclass to complete their degree. We are providing valuable educational opportunities to individuals who will be contributing members of this community. In closing, our message is we are anxious to have the decision made on evaluative criteria as quickly as possible, and we will do whatever is necessary to help you facilitate this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Ron Cooper. Yeah, okay.
Ron Cooper, Executive Director of Access Sacramento. And with the 3 that I have, I'm going to hit on some high points, and I look forward to meeting together with your Executive Director and the other leadership. And I hope interested board members are invited to participate too, because I think that's going to be a very valuable meeting. Overall, I'm listening carefully to what Sue Disciple described. There were many points that were raised that I don't think are new. But having a person from outside our community do the thorough kind of research that she did, certainly from our perspective anyway, in terms of what other public access facilities are doing and the funding and so forth, we really appreciate that thorough effort and appreciate that outsiders look in relative to other cities. I think it's always been something beyond the means, but certainly desired for all of us to get that kind of objectivity. There were just several points that I wanted to touch on. One is, it is a very capital-intensive business that we're in, and one thing I need to point out, this room is a very sterile room. This is not a public use facility. The content itself is a very predictable content. The people who appear on these cameras are known quantities.
Not very predictable, though.
Well, not always predictable, no. And you could say the same in terms of what KVIE does. You could say the same in terms of what the Ed Consortium does. Each of us, I think, I want to put a different spin in terms of what Sue was saying. Each of us has taken a very different mission and applied what resources we've been provided in different ways to serve that mission. And the one thing that I wanted to really point out is what we do is very people-intensive. It is the merge of humanity and technology, which is the challenge for our community and all communities. You've heard me say this before. This is not new information, but that is a difficult. What we say, oh, well, I know this and I know that, and what we actually do in practice, our young people, what actual equipment they have and how they master, and us old fogies, trying to catch up with a new world that changes so rapidly. It's a very people-intensive type of process, and so that's the challenge that we've undertaken, and we're glad to hear that that's valued both here and elsewhere. That also incorporates diversity. When we did the Census 10 languages explaining what that's knocking on your door is all about, that's an eye-opener. It's one thing to see diversity, and it's another thing to have effective communication among community. And so there's lessons that we've learned there and will continue to learn. Production is costly, and again, this to me is very important. Local production done by local people versus acquired programming. And we don't really clarify that. When Sue was pointing out that 80% of our budget goes toward that channel, I'd like to clarify what that means is that 80% of our resources go towards support of local production. And when we were talking to Jan and KVC, the cost of
quality production is tremendously, totally off the map of the dollars that we're talking about here. So just always keep that in mind in terms of local versus, and then just in conclusion, that again, it is about the money. It is the money. And I know, the staff of the city and the county are putting pressure on everybody to say how much is coming in. There's 3.5. How much can we count on? There are good reasons for that, and there's needs to be addressed. And we've never ever questioned you on those decisions. I implore you, though, think of what we do in the community. Think more we could do if
Ron,
we
you wanna
implemented
wrap it
the
up,
kind
please?
of directions. That's what I ask. Thank you.
Ron.
Okay, the next speaker, John Fleischman.
Good afternoon, or I guess close to good evening, Chairman Waters, members of the Commission. My name is John Fleischman, Director of Instructional Technology at the Sacramento County Office of Education, and also a member of the Board of SCCC. On behalf of Dr. David Meany, who's the County Office Superintendent, I had the privilege of attending the table workshop meeting on January 10th. I think the workshop provided participants with really good understanding of PEG programming, but I was a bit disappointed that time wasn't spent generating ideas for future direction. We're in a very exciting time, moving from an analog to a digital world. There's lots of tremendous possibilities, new technology. This was an opportunity to provide input, and I don't feel there was adequate time. In her presentation today, Sue spoke about procurement of services versus provision of services. I suppose the procurement model works well in many communities, but I believe the entitlement model has value and that it's been effective here in Sacramento. SCCC is a bare-bones operation that has been able to create a tremendous synergy among Sacramento education providers. Sue indicated that about 1/2 of education programs don't receive franchise funding. From my perspective, the small amount of funding provided to SCCC works effectively to seed programs. As an example, with seed funding via SEC, the office was able to make a connection to the fiber backbone. Now that we have a connection, we're investing real dollars in production and post-production and studio equipment. So that small seed is going to grow into what will ultimately be a tremendous and a major source of original programming serving educators, serving students throughout Sacramento County. One more theme that Sue addressed, accountability. I can guarantee you that SCCC welcomes the opportunity to be held accountable. We look forward to being held to measurement standards determined by the Commission, and we would welcome the opportunity to demonstrate how we're meeting the educational needs of Sacramento area residents. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Any questions? Thank you, John. Okay, next we have Spencer, I believe, followed by Candy Lamson, and then Jan Tillman.
Good evening. I'm Spencer Freund. I'm
Freund,
California State University. I'm the Associate Vice President of Telecommunications, also a member of the board at the SEC. It's very good to follow 4 people who have done such a great job in describing our challenge, but I would like to thank Isla Cullen, who recognized Commissioner Dickinson in a great speech. So thank you both for those opportunities.
That must mean you agreed with him.
I also, yes, I think I did.
That was just a...
Wanted to...
That's the second speech I've listened to with Roger today.
Well, Roger does a great job, and we have some very good tape that would describe that. One of the things that I think is important to point out, we have for many years demonstrated best practice. I think that's very clear. We have educated thousands upon thousands of people, and we have the statistics to prove it. Our benchmarks are in place, so we certainly can easily, as you heard before by Linda Martin, who put it well, provide you with the criteria by which we would measure our performance, and we're prepared to do that in a quantitative manner. I think what concerned me, however, though I think the report was very interesting, there are some areas in there which I think we need to be able to provide some input to the Commission. I'm not suggesting that there are inaccuracies, but I think there's always another side to a story. I think we're prepared to do that and help you understand those things. One of the areas that concerns me the most is that public education and channels all mean the same thing. They do not. That's like suggesting that news, weather, and sports means the same thing. And we talk about quality, forgive me, KCRA, but you don't do football like CBS or ABC or NBC or even ESPN. And I think we all understand that. But the quality is in the viewer. Are we fulfilling an obligation? Are we an individual? I think the point that was made is that we can do that with one person. I think the issue of channel recognition is important, and I really enjoyed your point that most people do not know the wealth of programming that's there. And we need to do more about that. And the technology will change. I am an engineer, one of my degrees. And we will have the ability to be able to look, the cable company improves their services, to be able to see, as we say, what's coming up next and what's coming up after that other than the 3.5 hours worth of programming. So you could forecast and not only that program for the week or the month of the year. Our educational services have been outstanding. People from all over the state come over to see what we do. I need you to know that there are some channels called ITF channels that we are licensed to in Sacramento. Our campus, Sacramento State, and because of the relationship we have with SEC, we are a model for the country. That's not my words, that's the FCC's words. So I think we have a lot to offer. We're prepared to work with you. I thank you for your time and effort.
Thank you. Next, Candy Lamson, followed by Jan Tiller. I'll just say Jan is the last one following Candy that I have signed up. So anyone else wishing to see this item, please sign up. Otherwise, that will be the
We do have one other tag for Candy Lamson.
This is Candy Lamson right here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Candy Lamson. I'm a member of the board of SEC. I represent Folsom Cordova Unified School District and the 6,000 students that particular district represents. And I do that because I'm interested in the services that SECC provides for our students in our community. Mr. Nilo and Mr. Dickinson raised a very good point about looking at the entitlement versus the procurement issue. And as I'd like to echo what Fleischman said, that I think it definitely has merit to look at the, I guess entitlement bothers me as the word because I don't see it as an entitlement. We are grantees. It's not we're asking for this money. At any time you have the opportunity, as you said, to set criteria or say yes or no to what we're asking for. But what we have is the opportunity to build a consortium while we add this ongoing relationship, and we have the entire area represented at our tables every month when we meet. Talk about a needs assessment. It's instant. We do it every month. We do a constant needs assessment and react to our constituency based on those and what comes out of those meetings. And we presented that information to you last year when you asked us about additional things that we could do if there was money. We actually gave you our answer to that question. We had done our own needs assessment of our community and our services that we provide, and so we had things on the table that said what we could do if we had additional funding. Mr. Yee asked a very good question. What could we get for additional money if we were to have the additional money? We've provided that answer from SCCC. We know where we're going, and we've given you that opportunity to look at what we're interested in doing. We don't want to miss this once in a franchise opportunity. This funding is coming in. We are not funded out of the general fund as many entities are. We need to look at only this amount of funding for any interest, and so we're asking you to please consider that and make a decision in our behalf. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Candy.
I had one question.
Yeah.
Candy?
Yes.
The one question, I know it's been on my mind in terms of, while we don't have the extra money that was referenced in the report, what we do have, I think, within each of the grants that we contract with, they have the ability to leverage and bring a lot more money to the table. And I think that's one of the things that we didn't talk about today. But every group is leveraging and bringing money. And I think the education community, since it takes...
It's tremendous. I remember the pie chart.
Huge. Yeah, I know, yeah. It's big. And
there's a lot of participation by a lot of different entities in this
and a lot of the capital then is leveraged into the endeavor from the community. I'm making an assumption that every group is having to do that. They're having to somehow raise funds, provide some capital, bring money in from a source that is not necessarily governmental or not necessarily franchise fees. But
Correct.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks, Kenny.
Thank you.
Just our ranks are dwindling here. Do we don't have any action items? I'm Jan, and then we'll sum up.
Actually, no, the only action item you had was the chair selection.
Okay, we'll go ahead and hear Jan's testimony. Anyone else that wishes to speak on this item, now's your last chance, because when the meeting's done, we're going to go back to commissioners and then to our direction staff at this point. Okay. Hi, Jen.
Hi. I'm Tillman from KVIE, that PBS station. We reject Concept 5. Just thought I'd put that on the record. Actually, I'm quite disappointed that we have lost the chair, and now I think 3 other members of the commission.
You still have a chair, okay.
All right.
Judge
I'm
Ford
very glad you're here.
Judge Ford is retiring this evening.
What's Nelly, chopped liver?
Oh, no. Excuse me, Mr. Vice Chair.
That's all right.
But each of the people who are not here now work for your consultant's report and are not here to hear my response. So I will make an effort to communicate with them as I can. We have considered our relationship with this Cable Commission as a partnership. And I'd like to add some perspective to that. This commission made an investment in our local public service on Channel 7. And KVIE has made an investment in that local service on Channel 7. At least, and perhaps doubled the investment that the commission has made in the ongoing operation of that channel. In addition to that, KVIE has purchased and provided all of the capital equipment necessary to operate this service. That's a partnership. Because it is unusual to partner with a local public television station, is not in itself a reason to defund and dismiss this partnership. The information presented here today about practices in other jurisdictions was very interesting. I learned a lot of things that I didn't before. The qualitative information is missing. The needs assessment is missing. And it's very curious to me that completely absent from this analysis is any information regarding the cable operator's viewpoint. They are in the business of servicing their customers. They must have or plan to do a needs assessment. I know that several years ago that Comcast Cable did do a needs assessment, and they did a survey of the subscribers' satisfaction about the local services. That was the broadcast channels in the area, as well as 11 of your channels. I also know what the results were of that survey. And the subscribers of this found that Channel 7 was very valuable. That needs assessment, that's a response from the community to your channel. We have at KVIE historically engaged the cable operator to inform our decisions about how we use the channel. And we have changed the way that we program that channel in some very substantial ways over time to be current with what other services the cable operator is offering and what the community is interested in. We look at our customer as the subscriber. We can intend to continue to solicit this kind of information from the cable company, from the commission, and to draw on KVIE's considerable expertise at doing community needs assessment. That's part of our business. That's what we do. We also provided you last year with a proposal about what we would do if there were additional funds available to better serve the community. I do hope the Commission has the wisdom to, in fact, make a qualitative assessment and judgment about the services that you're receiving for your investment. And I have faith and confidence in you that you will. On a completely different note, I'd like to invite you to tune in this evening on Channel 6 at 7 p.m. and tomorrow on Channel 7 at 7 p.m. for a very special 1-hour program on California's play. We partnered with KCET in Los Angeles, KQ in San Francisco, KPBS in San Diego, and we covered in a very substantial way what is going on today. It's current as of today in the California energy crisis. and I just thought you might be interested in seeing that.
Thanks,
It
Jen.
affects us all.
Thank you for your comments. Great.
Any questions?
Any questions, Ms. Tony?
Thank you.
Good, thanks, Jeff.
I think in Sue's defense, the cable operators were certainly interviewed, were certainly contacted, were also a part of our community forum. I understand her point, but they were not by any means not invited into this process. I'm not aware of the needs assessment they've done or whether that's been shared with the commission, but again, also that was not part of the charge.
Okay. Paul, we're getting to a fairly late hour here, and I think it's certainly defer to commissioners if they want to make any comments before we close them. But I think it's going to be important for the March report and discussion. It sounds to me that, as you pointed out in your opening comments, with the preliminary budgets coming forward and so forth, that issue from hearing comments from commissioners will, whether you intend to have the discussion or not, I think it's probably come up as we build budgets. So I would just suggest that you, and I knowing you in your position are very good, that be prepared for that discussion, because it was said about the podium today from a number of the grantees and other speakers, but also we heard it from commissioners up here. So in light of that, we're still looking at criteria. We're going to have that discussion report, but and that no funding decisions are made until later in the spring. I think it'll be important that we probably at least you be prepared, and other commissioners can weigh in. That discussion at least will potentially come up in March, as I said earlier. Okay. Let me ask anyone on this side final comments before we leave this item today.
The only final comment to make is relative to the testimony of the representatives from the PEG groups. Somebody made a comment about Ms. Seipel adroitly testing off bombs that didn't explode or something. I'm not sure, but the point is, we had an outside person come into our community and assess what we're doing in the light of what other communities do. And obviously what we do is quite different than what other communities do, and all she did was point that out. And I think that that is thought-provoking, and the questions that creates are valuable questions. Unfortunately, it challenges some premises that we have operated on in the past, and obviously presents potential threats to existing PEG grantees, and I would expect that they would be a bit uncomfortable with that, and that's certainly only natural. But I think that the analysis is worthwhile, and we have to remember that we're struggling with allocating scarce resources that we're getting from people that pay cable bills. This isn't my money. It's money that's paid to us by people who pay those bills. And I think to have a rigorous analysis of how we do it, question quality of service is a legitimate, and it certainly doesn't mean that we're going to wholesale change things, but it certainly does mean that we're going to think about it.
Thank you.
I'll make a comment. I think in terms of getting ready for that March meeting, I think it becomes abundantly clear after listening today and contemplating where we are and having understanding of how we got to where we are, that I don't think that we are going to be ready to do anything that remotely is going to set criteria for this budget session. I just don't think that's going to happen. And facing that reality, I'd be interested in the feedback of any other meetings at the meeting, but I don't think it's realistic to be able to do that. To make a lot of steps in terms of change, I would like money figures, if you can, on how we could get the message out better, so we can get the cooperation. I've stated that before. I think that also something that we did do last year. I would like the people that have been doing this programming historically from the beginning of the franchise to search when they're putting together their budgets and they're putting together the type of their own internal criteria and their own sense of where they're going. I really want to feel for what they think they're going to need in programming. I think they've said already, several, that they provided this last budget session. I think they're fully prepared to do that again. And even if we don't come up with any definitive criteria, I think we can discuss some ways of and some strategies for how do we better use perhaps some of the, I'll still call it channel capacity, that we have out there in terms of the program that somehow, even through their own self-evaluation of what some needs are out there, might be needed, if that's any sense. I mean, Citrus Heights would love to do live broadcasts. I'm sure that Folsom would too. Where could they find that space? Is there space on some of the other channels? How do we accomplish that? Those are things that we have, I think, an ability to influence. And if any of this steps on anybody's toe from a legal standpoint, Harriet, you can tell me. But I think that'll be helpful to keep moving this process forward this year.
I think you have the ability to implement the types of things that you were talking about.
That also include the religious channel. It receives absolutely no funding, but it does have channel capacity.
Right. My recollection, and I will double check this before your next meeting, is that as part of the settlement, all the channels were turned over to you.
I thought they were too. But
you have never really relooked at the allocation of those channels.
The time on those channels, I think we've depended on the groups to cooperate and find time for each other's channels that are really the cable commission channels.
Where a lot of the conversation's going today is what I'm sort of hearing is that the commission is recognizing that everything from the 30 megahertz to 7 channels is a community asset, and what you're getting to these questions in this analysis is showing is that we may need really a broader look at how do we look at that asset and how do we allocate that asset. And yes, we may need a needs analysis, but I mean that is, we had this small consultant $25,000 study to get some specifics, and now we're looking, and that is perfectly appropriate. In fact, probably overdue, quite frankly, that the commission looks at these type of issues. But I agree with you. If we're going to go in that direction, and it's certainly appropriate, certainly is a good direction to go. It's not going to happen by a funding cycle of this year. It probably needs to look at it, and if you're going to go down that road, you're really taking the mission in a direction that may even look at things again like staffing. You may not want a 10% executive director if you're going to go in that type of direction.
Okay. I just think we ought to be realistic about this year's budget cycle and come up with a good strategy for how we're going to handle it.
And I will try and work that out with the grantees, too, and when we get together and see if we can come up with some type of strategy to bring before the commission next month.
That's what I mean. Short month.
Yeah, that's a short one.
Any other comments then?
No.
Okay. Paul, I think it'll be important, too, that understanding the importance and certainly the length of time dedicated to this particular topic today, and that mix that budget discussion and knowing the previous times we've had that, how much time is encompassed there. We need to, I think, structure the agenda in such a way that you allow one adequate time about the report that will be before us, for the public input that we will receive, and then if you bring back other ideas relative to budget and so forth, discussion, and you certainly can't predict what that will bring about, but I do think it's going to be important from a time standpoint, because we've been at it nearly 3 hours here today, that we, appropriately on the agenda. So if we have other items that, however you prioritize the order of those, make sure that we've got that structured in a way that completes the action items if we go along.
Okay.
Anything you want to add, Harry, at this point? Any further direction you need at this point?
No.
Okay. Good. I want to thank once again Ms. Disciple for her presentation, for all the folks who spoke, and I think as everyone that's here today understands, we'll be back in March with further discussion along the lines of what we've talked about here today. So, okay, with that, if there's no other comments then on item number 1, you call for some action, give the staff direction. I guess we just continue this item to March 1st. Is that correct? Yes, motion will be in order. Do I have a motion?
So move.
Second.
Okay, moved and seconded to continue this matter to March 1st, 2001. If there's no further questions, comments, all those.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? So ordered. All right, moving down to item number 2,
And that's basically, we just have very brief presentations by, the presentation by AT&T, and I know they're going to make it quick, just an update on what's happening.
They never thought they'd be here that long, that's why they'll
They
make it
deserve
quick.
to say a couple minutes after this.
Okay, just please introduce yourself at the podium and we'll go.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Susan Ritchie, Government Affairs VP for AT&T. Short story, we closed at 11:59 December 31st, and hopefully that was transparent to customers, and there's been no change, and we don't anticipate any change. So it's business as usual for us. The phones are ringing, and we're doing installs, and hope to have a successful product lineup here.
When does the change on our bills?
Probably second quarter, you'll start writing your bills at AT&T.
Okay, thank you.
A couple items I'll add is that the disclosure requirements of the new franchise fee also did go out. It came in my bill. So, that is the legal requirement there has been met.
Small print?
That very small print.
Not our idea.
So that is, and the collection of that will actually begin fairly quick, but we won't really collect any of the money until May. And for this budget cycle, they will be allocated back to the parental entity. It was your policy of any extra money that wasn't allocated goes to the parental entities. You, of course, can change your mind if you so desire, but our directions will be whatever we collect this year will just be distributed to the checks to the parental entities, and then next year is when you'll really allocate the additional franchise.
Fiscal year, correct, Paul?
Fiscal year.
Yes, this fiscal year, correct. I press.
By the way, what is your subscription base now?
What is the base? In terms of number of customers?
Yes.
It's about 240, 245.
240, 245, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions, Susan? Okay, great. Thanks for being with us today. Thanks for staying. Good.
When?
Carlotta?
Hi.
Hi.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the Commission. I'd introduce myself formally. I am Carlotta Gutierrez, Regional Director of Governmental Relations for Wind First, or WIND. And I take this opportunity just again to formally introduce myself and let you know that we are working with the staff to, in the upcoming months, have a larger presentation in terms of our efforts here in the county, construction currently going on in Atomas, and how we are connecting to our location, which is at McCollum Park. With that, I won't take any more of your time. So questions, if not, we will, I'm sure, have a much more in-depth session in a couple of months.
We were hoping to do that in March. Given our conversation, I think we'll probably wait until April.
She might appreciate that.
Yeah, she might. But they are, several of you as in your, are going to start getting some phone calls because WIN is out in the communities now. WIN First, I need to get that myself done. And they are doing some digging and putting some infrastructure in. And so I think the sooner we get WIN First in front of the Commission, your update, they're going to try and be meeting with your aides of that so that you're aware, but we really do think it's getting time that they let you know this is happening.
Which streets,
and
where, huh?
That's right. You will be getting phone calls.
Well, I think absent a presentation by Carlotta or with Wind First, that it would be important maybe to, if they not only a schedule build, but if we know at least some written alerts so that in addition to any conversation they might have, meeting with representatives of the various elected officials, I think it'd be important for city managers, for county executives and other folks, public works agencies who have that, but to have that information so that calls do come in absent a full presentation. Paul, that would maybe a good.
And that is actually being prepared. Harriet has drafted some letters. We're getting the public works folks as well as to each. So we're getting those letters together now.
Okay.
With WIN.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank
Any
you
other
very
questions? Any other questions? Good. Thank you for being with us today. We look forward to a full presentation in the months ahead. Any other reports on that?
As far as status report, just to remind you that the Commission has some cap-to-cap funding for those of you who wish to go. I think we outlined it in a memo, and some partial reimbursement. We talked about AT&T. I want to bring up that we've had several meetings with the City of Elk Grove and their membership on the Commission, and everything's going very smoothly there. And lastly, just point out that we have some, you may have noticed as you turn on Channel 14, we have a lot of new cameras in here and cameras in our van, and some cameras in City Hall, and you're hopefully seeing better, sharper, good pictures, things of that sort, as we've done some equipment upgrades.
Yeah, we get to see you one instead of that side view. Looks much better.
A perfect improvement.
Still side view.
Yes, Mr. Yee.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to discuss this issue of the funding, partial funding on the cap-to-cap.
Okay.
Yes.
Because we are having more on this board, or from different cities. I'd like to ask this board to consider raising the 3,000 to a maximum of 5,000.
That'll be a budget augmentation.
I think we can assume it within the current budget.
Yes,
No
if
problem.
I schedule that for an action item, though, in the March agenda. It's not an action item day, it's only a report. Is that correct? So,
But using the same criteria.
Yeah, we
They can
certainly
just
could do
provide
that. We
direction
could
to
schedule
staff.
it. I'm not sure if it could be acted upon. It really wasn't agenda, or could it be?
or does it need to be?
Or even does it need to be, or you can just give us instructions? I mean,
and I
certainly the
think-
money is available.
Yeah, what we need to do is figure out who needs to augment their budget, and so you'll know which ones are going to be
Correct.
available for
Correct.
what you need to do at the back in DC at the meetings.
Now,
Does anybody have a feel for that, Tony? Or?
Well, let me break apart, though. Ms. Collins makes a good point, but let's kind of just separate, though, from the standpoint of the dollar amount first and how that has to be acted upon. Does that need a separate action?
Well, it's on your agenda right now.
Okay.
And so you can
Have a
act on
quorum.
it right now, and
It's
you
on the
still have a
agenda.
quorum. So if you want to take action, the fact that staff has recommended to receive and file does not preclude you from taking action on the
But it only
item
talks
you're
about
listed on
3,000
the
in here.
agenda.
Now, but the flexibility still remains, obviously, for us to make a decision. But could we?
We have allocated 3,000 in our budget for that. If you wanted to allocate 5,000, a motion to change, we certainly could do that.
I'll make that motion.
And you just need a unanimous vote now.
I'll second it because more people and the trips are more expensive.
And you would unanimous vote in order to
Okay.
pass it.
All right. Well, we have a motion and a second then before the 32. Move from 3,000 to 5,000. That would be the cap on the reimbursement to the member agencies and the representatives that would represent this commission and matters back in Washington, D.C. on the capital trip. If there's any questions or comments on that item?
It's 3,000 to 5,000, the cap on...
The cap.
Pro-rata share.
But the total amount that the commission will spend?
It's $5,000.
Okay, so
And
rather than a total of 3,000, we're allocating $5,000.
Yeah.
Folks go and represent our interests on the cap.
Some of the smaller.
Yeah.
Okay. And, all right, so whether it's 5 or 10 people who represent us, the pro-rata allocation. Okay. All right. Anyone else, any comments? All right, we have a motion before us, then all those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Assume it was all ayes. I didn't hear them all, but okay. All right. Did you want to follow up? You had some questions about who was going to go, Ms. Collins, on this?
No, I think that probably be decided with
Correct.
staff.
We just need to be notified by anybody that's interested in utilizing any of these funds, and then we can determine how many are interested. That can do sort of the allocation on a pro rata basis.
That's true, because they're taking sign-ups and get everything going now.
It's that time. That's why I wanted to get this on the agenda.
Anything else, Paul, under either item 2 or 3 that we just were discussing? Okay. Other comments by commissioners? If not, then we've already taken care of item 4 and to item number 5 then on the agenda. And that's public opportunity to discuss matters not on the agenda but within commission jurisdiction. I had one person signed up to speak on this. It's Ron Cooper. Ron?
He's getting 2 bites of the apple. What are you doing here?
Thanks, Isla. Basically, there's a tape up there that is the 9 short videos, digital videos that were created and projected at the Crest Theater as part of the film festival. And I bring that especially to attention because, Isla, you were talking about, the value of training. And the best way to look at it is to see it. So please do take a look at that. Super Bowl's over. It's not safe to give you the 2-hour video, so I don't know what will be taped over, but please take a look at it. I think it's an incredible, primarily volunteers with some professional support. So that's exciting. Also, there's a blue flyer there, which is a release from the local Indian community who is putting together earthquake relief for the tragedy in India and has approached Access Sacramento. And I wanted to bring this to your attention because the telethon for disaster relief, the American Red Cross, and also the Prime Minister's Fund for Relief, so very level money will get there and do some good, is going to be held on 73 from 5 to 8 p.m. on a week from this Sunday. So I want to bring it to your attention because about a year or so ago, remember, we had a big discussion about when and where it would be appropriate. And I just want you to know that we're watchdogging that. I don't think there's anybody would disagree that this is very appropriate coming from the Indian community. And we've also been approached by the El Salvadoran community. So we're looking into that for March then as a possible fundraising telethon, one-time event for those victims as well. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Thank you for your efforts to help out the people in the country so tragically hit by these disasters. Okay. had no one else to speak on item 5, and that is the conclusion of the agenda. Any commission members, any closing items? None. If not, then the gavel will come down. We're adjourned. Thank you for being.
Thank you.
See you.
The merciful gavel.
Merciful gavel.
Housing Community Development meeting in